Hey everyone, I'd like to welcome you to the State of America Summit. I'm Craig Newmark, who you might know as the Craigslist guy, but I'm also the lead sponsor of the Civic Life Series at the 92nd Street Y, New York. We're getting closer to Election Day, we're looking ahead to 2024, and we got to understand the pivotal role we're all playing in helping shape the future of our communities, the future of our nation, and the future of the globe. We got to do what it takes to restore decency, dignity, and trust in our democratic institutions and all of society. Being engaged is the first step. I'm really happy to continue the partnership between my philanthropic thing and the 92nd Street Y, New York. We're bringing you trustworthy and transparent pro-democracy content. We know that delivering accurate and nonpartisan information is really important, building a healthy and well-functioning democracy. There's no better forum than the 92nd Street Y, New York State of America Summit. Today's program will break down some really big deals, some of the most pressing and thought-provoking challenges and opportunities facing our country. This goes from fighting mis- and disinformation to the increased role of Gen Z and young people as we push political discourse forward. You're doing your part in strengthening our country, strengthening our democracy by joining us here today, and I'm actually proud to be involved in the State of America Summit to help enlighten and maybe inspire you, the next generation of people who are defending our democracy and defending our country. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
Hello and welcome to the 92nd Street Y, New York's 5th State of America Summit. I'm Seth Pinsky, CEO of 92NY. We're entering the 2024 election cycle facing critical elections across the country at every level of government, including here in New York. The 2024 election will determine our future, helping shape what America will look like going forward. The future of reproductive rights, free and fair elections, immigration, and our rights as citizens are all on the line at this pivotal moment. And speaking of pivotal moments, in 2024, the 92nd Street Y is also entering an important year, celebrating 150 years of culture, engagement, and conversation with New Yorkers and people from around the world. Even after doing so for a century and a half, we remain committed to these conversations and to bringing people together both in person and virtually around the globe to explore the key topics of the day. We hope that you agree that events such as this one make the case for this kind of civil civic dialogue. That's why we're so proud to be presenting the summit's lineup of conversations with some of the most influential and inspiring voices in American politics, public policy, advocacy, and academia. Thank you for joining us. Before we dive into today's program, I want to express our gratitude to the State of America's lead sponsor, Craig Newmark Philanthropies. The generous support from Craig Newmark Philanthropies makes both today's summit and the Newmark Civic Life Series possible. We thank Craig Newmark Philanthropies for their backing and for enabling us to host these critical discussions about the future of our country. And now, let's start today's event. Thank you again for engaging with us and for tuning in.
Thank you, everyone, for being here this morning. My name is Victor Shi. This is such an exciting and complex topic that we're going to be talking about today about young people and what they have to offer. So I'm glad to have 4 people with me on this panel rather than just 1 or 2, although I'm sure each of them, as you will hear from, are amazing in their own unique way. It's really my goal by the end of this conversation, whether you are a Gen Zer or a baby boomer or any generation in between, that you understand not only why I'm so hopeful about young people and my peers, but also some of the challenges challenges, I think, and ways to help empower young people to get involved as 2024 rolls around. So without further ado, I'm going to do a quick introduction of all of our amazing panelists. We have with us Amanda Littman, who is the founder of Run for Something, an amazing organization that recruits and really helps young people to run for office. John Della Volpe, who is the head of polling at Harvard Institute of Politics, also an MSNBC and NBC political contributor. Cameron Kasky, who is a gun violence prevention activist and just 22 years old. And Nabila Syed, who is from my home state, Illinois, and is the first Gen Z member of the Illinois state legislature. So it is really my honor to be able to have all of them here with us today, and for all of you to be able to learn from them as I do so often. So let's get started. I just want to set the scene for 2024. We've seen all the headlines starting really back in 2020, but really before then, about how young people are saving our democracy and how they will be key for any party if they want to have any chance of winning for any election. So I'm going to start with John and sort of just go around the horn on my screen and just ask you if you are bullish or bearish about where the youth vote stands right now and as we head into 2024, and why.
That's a complex, nuanced question. We'll hopefully talk a little bit more about it. I'm generally very, very bullish, right? We have a very different country today because of the efforts of many of you on the screen and in the audience today. Without question, Donald Trump is president. Mitch McConnell is leading the Senate without the impact that young people have had in 20 and 22. Those key 5 battleground states that flip from red to blue, Donald Trump and the Republicans won voters over the age of 45. It's millennials and Gen Zers which flip those. Having said that, I think it's kind of my responsibility to be honest and to be direct, and that it's a different youth vote today than it was 4 years ago. So there's a little bit of cynicism. There's a little bit of bearishness in me. There's some cynicism growing, and I just want everyone to be cognizant of that as well.
Awesome. Cameron, do you want to, as the 22-year-old activist who's been in this fight for gun violence prevention, how are you feeling? How are your peers feeling right now?
You know, I worry that people are going to think this election is going to be too easy. I know that a lot of people are going to have the desire to have an opinion on it. I know a lot of people will take a side and want to stand for something. I don't know how many people will actually get to the polls for that, especially our age. The stakes are high. The administration is doing virtually everything it can to win over the youth vote. Especially in the past couple weeks, even, there have been so many efforts that have very, very clearly played into what young people are looking for and what everybody's looking for. But there's a degree to which I fear people will grow a little apathetic to the situation, and they'll be happy to have an opinion about Biden versus whoever it may be, presumably Trump. But I don't know what the energy is going to look like actually translating to the ballot box.
Mm-hmm. Amanda, I want to go to you next. As the head of Run for Something, you have amazing statistics about just the number of young people who have expressed interest, who have run for office, who have won office, as we see here with Representative Nabila Syed. Can you talk a little bit about how you're feeling, bullish or bearish, as we approach 2024 in terms of that sort of young people running for office?
I think we have seen record numbers of young people express interest in getting on the ballot, especially for state and local office, where they can really move the needle on the issues they care about, housing, reproductive health, voting rights, climate change, transportation, gun violence. At this point, these decisions are being made in state capitals and on school boards and state-led and city councils across the country. And I am cautiously optimistic that we're going to have a record number of Run for Something candidates on the ballot in 2024. And we have hundreds on the ballot in just a couple of weeks in Virginia and dozens of other states across the country who are knocking doors and talking to voters in a way that can really excite them about something specific and tangible and real, in a way that maybe the presidential election might not. It might feel a little too abstract, but when you have someone coming to your door who wants to talk to you about how they're going to make your rent go down because they're going to build more housing in your community or make it easier for you to get access to the healthcare you need, that can be really exciting, even when the other bigger stuff might not be.
Absolutely. And I'm going to turn to State Representative Syed. How are you feeling about sort of the work that you've been able to do in the Illinois State Legislature and kind of 2024 and that momentum heading into that election?
Yeah, I'm going to rely a little bit more on my own anecdotal evidence. Every time I go to some kind of event in the district, or if, I'm running for re-election now, so knocking on doors, and I'll talk to a parent of someone I went to school with, and they'll tell me that their child called them from San Francisco to vote for me and make sure that they went down to the ballot box. And I think what what we're seeing is what Amanda pointed out. So many young people are expressing interest in running for office and deciding to run for office, and that is building momentum. Young people becoming activists, getting involved in the space. The amount of activity on Twitter, on X, whatever it's called. I think that, just looking at that anecdote, those anecdotes I see, the examples in my own district with my own election, we mobilize young people in our little area in Illinois, and I think we're going to start seeing these movements that have been happening and are going to continue to happen in different parts of the country. And I'm optimistic that that's going to shake up in 2024 to help out the Democratic Party overall.
Absolutely. So, John, I want to turn to you next because it seems like we have two sort of different tracks here. We have, I think, a really substantial movement of young people, but also there's a lot that seems like polls and headlines sort of get wrong about young people in this generation. I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit and what you think sort of overall people get wrong, sort of the media polls fail to capture. I know you do your polling at Harvard, and sort of kind of the differences between your poll and most other polls out there, and sort of what makes this generation unique.
Yeah, so I think Victor, just one of the reasons that I think a lot of polls seem relatively close, or the polls that I've seen where Trump is tied or ahead by a couple points, my sense is that's usually kind of directly connected to what those youth crosshairs are showing, right? A lot of those polls, like the well-known ABC one of a few weeks ago, had that very close for Trump, leading him on this generation, which of course, I don't think there's any chance of that actually happening, right? So we have to be really careful, and we're fortunate that, we're interviewing 5,000 or so, 6,000 young people a couple of times a year through the Harvard Youth Poll. I've been doing it for 25 years. And I think there's two or three things that I think it's important for the audience, and specifically folks who want to build a relationship and actually mobilize people. One is understanding these kind of the unique set of values. And the way in which I think about a millennial versus a member of the Gen Z generation is, do you have a living memory of 9/11? Because if you do, I would argue you're a millennial, which means you also saw September 12th and September 13th, when our country came together, and whichever county you were in, or red or blue, people felt a connection to the community, to the country, and hung a flag. Sadly, Cameron, Representative Syed, and so many members of their generation don't have that memory of America at our best. Instead, their memories are of trauma, like yourself, and chaos, without seeing America at our best. And all of those things happening before, young people turn the age of 25, which is a neuroscience says we're mature enough to be able to process this information. So I think one thing that's important for everyone to understand is this is a generation that's dealt with more trauma more quickly than any generation since at least the greatest generation. Yet, despite that, rather than fleeing, I think, as we can see here, they're fighting, and so much of my work is inspired by the work of Cam and your friends and community members from Parkland, and such an important role, I think, in the development of the value set of this generation, that you're not going to take it, you're going to step in, challenge all of us in an intergenerational way to help out. So I think understanding that the context of the last 15 or 20 years is really an important place to start.
There was a great video the other day that sort of went viral. Vice President Kamala Harris asking a bunch of students, how many of you have been in a lockdown drill? And everyone raised their hand. I think it was at Florida International University, which makes me want to go to Cameron next. You've talked about a little bit in the introduction of what this administration has done over the past couple of weeks. Specifically, we've seen just the amazing advocacy efforts that you and your peers have done really come to fruition with this new gun violence prevention office headed by Vice President Harris. But what are you hearing from young people about this administration? Because there seems to be, I think, a gap between what this administration is doing and what young people are feeling. Can you talk about that a little bit, and what you think sort of can bridge that divide and hopefully get young people to see all of the things that President Biden, Vice President Harris, and their administration are doing for young people?
What I'm hearing is not enough, which is very disappointing because, we have the American Climate Corps now, we have the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, we have student debt getting slashed, and I seem to hear tons about it when it's not happening, but then when it happens, I unfortunately don't get to see the effects that it should have, which is young people saying excitedly, here are our interests being represented. So I would love to see more energy around these different efforts that, as I've said, are so effective and so important. And what I would love to see is that reflected in the ballots this year. I'd love to see young people mobilize like that. But I also think there's a degree of comfort when we have an administration that's working, where when you got somebody like Trump in office, there's this desire to go out and vote because we need to stop something. Right now, that remains the case, but we have a caretaker in the office and people feel to a certain degree taken care of. And I just don't know. I hate to leave this off the way that I left my last question off, but I don't know what that's going to mean in terms of mobilizing young people. I hope that young people go out and say everything we are asking for to some degree is being met with action. But, the administration's doing what the administration can. And the question is now, what are we going to do to continue these efforts?
So you sort of have what's happening on the federal level, but you see what's happening in states like Illinois, where Representative Syed is a member of the state legislature, and you have these sort of Democratic trifectas in the state House, the state Senate, and also the governorship. So if people feel like maybe things aren't happening at a quick enough or bold enough pace on the federal level, Representative Syed, can you talk about what's happening on the state level and what you're hearing from young people about sort of the pace of action happening there? Because I see what's happening in Illinois, and it seems like just really tremendous. Can you talk about what's happening on that level and sort of how your being a Gen Z has sort of shifted the conversation in a little bit?
Yeah, well, I'm very proud to be from Illinois. And you mentioned that trifecta, and that trifecta is allowing us to get a lot of good things done. Last session, before I was even elected, a few days before I was inaugurated, they passed assault weapons ban in Illinois, which was huge for our state. It was a big push, and they got it done. And then, this past session, I passed a bill that's the first of its kind in the nation to prohibit price gouging of off-patent and generic drugs. And for a freshman member to be able to do that in a state, even in the state legislature, it's an uphill battle. But in a state like Illinois, we understand that things need to get done. People are looking for help. And I do think, when people are expressing frustration at the state level or even at the federal level, those frustrations are valid, and they're helpful to me as an elected official to continue pushing the envelope. Sometimes I'm sitting here and I'm like, why aren't safe storage laws easier to, why can't we raise the age in Illinois? Why isn't it easier to get this done? But then going to the doors and hearing the frustration from young people about, why are we still living in fear, even in a state like Illinois, where we have this trifecta, but more needs to be done and more can be done. And I do believe it's the support of the work that so many folks, even folks at the doors, activists, advocacy organizations are doing to hold elected officials, hold their feet to the fire to make progress on these issues. So Illinois is a great place to be, and it's going to continue to become an even better place. I hope so.
I mean, it's so inspiring to see yourself and so many young people really rise and run for office. But as we all, I'm sure on this panel and many in our audience know, there are so many barriers at the same time keeping young people from running for office. And, Amanda, your organization, the goal is to get more young people running specifically for local and state level offices. And of course, on the federal level as well. But can you talk about some of the challenges that face young people in general who want to run for office? And what are some of the best ways to make it easier for a young person who might be interested in running for office?
Love this question. So we've got some structural barriers, like, for example, many state legislative offices and basically all local offices are unpaid, which means you have to already have a source of income if you're going to be able to run for these, or the kind of job that will let you be flexible to go serve. Many of these offices are also full-time jobs, even if they're not technically or in nominally full-time jobs. They require a full-time time commitment. There are in many places some transportation issues or time constraint issues that will especially make it harder for people who maybe don't have access to their own car or have caregiving responsibilities. All of that can make it really hard for people in their 20s or even in their 30s to run. There's also gatekeepers who tend to think that young people are risky bets. And I'm sure Representative Syed remembers this well from when she ran. People will say, wait your turn. You're not a good candidate. You're not a good fit for the district. We just don't think you can win. A theory that is based entirely in bullshit. It's a thing that people say when they don't think you can raise money, which is something that for especially young people, young women, young people of color, and young women of color, it's a way to rule them out. Now, that doesn't mean that it's impossible. In fact, what it means is that you can outwork and out-hustle your opponent and often surprise them. What Run for Something is here to do is help you figure out how to get around some of those structural barriers where we can, and just as important, connect you to a community of people who are running too. One of the things we hear from the candidates we work with basically every cycle is that their greatest source of resiliency, the greatest resource we can provide, is a relationship with someone else running for office or who's recently run in the same life circumstance. To know that it's hard because it's hard, not because you are a failure or incompetent, and that there are ways that folks we've worked with before have found to get around some of these structural barriers, and then we'll help you open all these doors.
Wonderful. So I want to ask all of you something that I get asked a lot, which is sort of, what is the best way to get young people to care about politics? What is the best way for young people to feel excited about voting and be civically participate civically in our democracy? What are the best things that you're hearing from just sort of on the ground, sort of kind of in your spaces? And maybe we can start backwards this time, start with Amanda and then go to Nabila and then Cameron and then John.
Give them people like Nabila to vote for, someone who understands them, understands their community, understands their concerns, and is going to fight for them. If there's a really good candidate on the ballot, young people are going to show up for them.
Yeah, I would just echo that. Well, thank you for that shout out, Amanda. I can't say that answer, but truly like finding candidates, making sure that even like as advocacy organizations, as people that might be able to donate time or money, making sure that we're propping up candidates that are worth believing in. And we're so used to being inspired by fear and being, driven to the polls by fear, getting these like mass emails, getting these, seeing what's on Fox News and CNN. And instead of making it so scary, try to provide solutions, try to provide a pathway forward. And that's what young people want to see. We know we're going to be the ones living on this earth the longest. The consequences of these decisions that are being made are going to affect us the most. And I like to think that people don't want to be inspired by getting scared. They want to be inspired by hope and by a promise for a better future.
I think that Biden's victory and the promise of stability that came with that gave some people the wrong idea that young people and people who are pushing new ideas that are not quite the caretaker ideas will not be able to get that sort of support. But there's a reason that Andrew Gillum lost to Ron DeSantis by a hair and Charlie Crist was absolutely eviscerated. It wasn't because DeSantis is so very amazing and popular. It was because Charlie Crist is an old Republican who was wearing a Democrat mask. So I think if you give people somebody to vote for instead of somebody to vote against, it's a very different story. And I understand that fear is a very real factor in how many people vote. I mean, after the Parkland shooting, a lot of the reasons that young people got involved were they saw what happened to us and said, we can be next. So there's a balance you have to strike in terms of showing people how bad things can be, which countries are going to invade Poland if whoever is president. But there's also a degree to which we need to show people what next steps are possible, which candidates are going to be able to progress what we want and not the candidates who are going to be able to, just take care of everybody. I think that we need to strike a balance, invest in young candidates, find the candidates like an Andrew Gillum who have a promise for a future, and not the candidates like Charlie Crist who can promise us nothing but 4 more years of Ron DeSantis.
And just to echo some of the broader themes, Victor, I think a lot of the barriers that I spent time thinking about are kind of attitudinal barriers. And then kind of the question of, does my vote make a difference? Can politics, can government make a difference? And over 25 years, we've seen a couple of moments, basically once in a generation, where those attitudes have shifted, where people can see the tangible difference between Democrats and Republicans, between engaging and not engaging, pre and post 9/11 and pre and post Trump, which led to significant increases of youth support. I'll just give you an anecdote. I was in Florida recently doing a focus group at the front end, I was asking some Zoomers and some young millennials kind of what some of their biggest concerns were. And one was because like a lack of a concern about lack of access to quality healthcare, kind of in the mid to late 20s. The rest of the conversation was quite cynical, that they didn't think government could solve any of their problems. And then I kind of reminded them that folks in the room likely were able to spend, to be part of their parents' health insurance, and that was Obamacare. And there was no one in the room who understood. They're all using it. No one understood that was actually an example of government working to specifically kind of benefit young people. So it's about the attitude and driving down that cynicism, and also kind of celebrating those little victories along the way. The victories that everyone here on this panel, clearly kind of represents, and not taking that for granted.
So, we started off this conversation. I think John's first answer was kind of talking about our current political moment and just all this chaos that we're seeing across the country. We see in the House, we just came after this motion to vacate Speaker McCarthy, or I guess no longer Speaker McCarthy. But I want to end this conversation by talking about sort of hope and unity and sort of what we're seeing from young people. And just to go around one more time, first, tell us what gives you hope, whether it's a state race, whether it's a young person out there. What gives you hope right now, and what is the best resource, best place for our audience who might be curious about what more they can do to get involved? And maybe we can start with John this time, and then end with Nabila.
Yeah, I think that what gives me hope is, again, despite the clear mental health challenges that so many people face, the anxiety that is said, rather than kind of fleeing, younger people are engaging. And what that means is, right, that when millennials, when Gen Xers, or when baby boomers, when we were young voters, we voted, at least in the midterm levels, at half the rate that your generation does. That gives me incredible hope. Basically, the same stories happening in the general elections, breaking records, and that gives me just tremendous amount of hope. And I'm going to let the other panelists share where you think the best information is to get engaged. So thanks.
Sure. Cameron, do you want to go next?
This one's a little specific, but I think that the WGA strike gave me a lot of hope, because I think that specific union is extremely influential with unions across the country. And I think that when workers get more power and when workers understand their power, that has a ripple effect that makes everybody see just what holding out and fighting can really mean. I think a lot of young people, as we've touched upon many times on this panel, feel as though our ballots don't count, our ballots don't matter. But when workers in working movements come together, bury their feet in the ground and say, we will not move, and then they win, I think that solidarity is something that affects people across the board.
Yeah. And what is the best resource that people can go look up if they want to do more to help support young people like you?
I think that people should take it issue by issue. I think that, whether it's the climate related issues, gun violence prevention, healthcare, I don't like to think of there being a central hub. I'd like to think that, each issue has many organizations mobilizing in ways that are important. And I don't believe that there's one specific place somebody should look. I think that you should take the issues that matter to you and look to the leaders in each of those spaces.
Love it. Amanda, do you want to go next?
I am so inspired by the fact that there are more than 300 Run for Something endorsed candidates on the ballot across 38 states in just a couple weeks, including more than 100 who are really under the age of 30. Those are young people who have wildly changed their lives and changed potentially their careers to make their communities a better place. More than half are people of color, more than half are women, more than a third are LGBTQ. And this isn't off year. There are no off years, but this is commonly understood to be a quiet year. That's hundreds of young people who are going to be leading their communities, win or lose, after Election Day.
An important reminder.
Think it's incredible. And so much that gives us hope for the future and shows us what's possible, so that if you are watching this and you're like, maybe I want to be someone like Representative Syed, or one of the hundreds of Run for Something candidates on the ballot, you can go to runforsomething.net to learn more. You can find information on how to get on the ballot. It is absolutely not too late and definitely not too early to get started thinking about your campaign for 2024, 2025, or beyond.
an important reminder that there are so many elections happening literally like as we speak. It's not just presidential or midterm elections. There are elections happening all across the country at all levels and amazing young people running for those. Representative Syed, I'm going to turn to you next.
This is going to be so broad, but I think whenever I go on social media and I see a young person repost something related to politics, advocating for something they care about, even I know lots of young people feel, a bit conflicted about the current administration. Folks like exchanging discourse about that gives me hope too, because it's important that our generation is aware of what's happening. It's important that our generation feels empowered to partake in this space and demand some kind of ownership of parts of the space too, because like I said, the policies that we're making now are going to affect young people the most. And anytime someone, I see a young person on my Instagram feed that's like, I'm running for office, that gives me so much hope. And even thinking about my own experience, I ran for office when I was 22, got elected at 23. At 24, I passed a bill to allow 16-year-olds to pre-register to vote. And to think that we're capable of doing this kind of work and that young people are doing it, that gives me hope. So I'm excited. I'm excited for this next election cycle. I'm optimistic that we're going to see record-breaking youth voter turnout, and I'm going to be knocking on wood and knocking on doors all the way up until 2024.
I hope everyone watching this will pay close attention to every one of these panelists, because they are doing so much to get young people to care about and really mobilized ahead of the 2024 election. I don't want this conversation to end here, so I want to ask all of you, where is the best place that people who are watching this or listening to this can find you? I guess we can start with State Representative Syed.
X, Twitter, whatever it is, Instagram, Facebook. We have a website, nabilasayed.com. Please don't hesitate to reach out. And if you're a young person that's considering running for office, please consider me a resource, as well as Run for Something, which is the first place you should go, and then come over to me as well.
Amanda?
Runforsomething.net is where you go online. You can find me, Amanda Littman, or Amanda Litm, on all kinds of platforms. Doing too much online, but you can find me there.
Awesome. Cameron?
I don't encourage anybody to look at my social media. I would send everybody to runforsomething.net, and I would send everybody to moveon.org, because I think that their efforts right now to get people reading banned books are very, very important. And I am very, very worried as a Florida escapee about what is happening with banned books. So runforsomething.net, moveon.org, and Google, because normally when you look up a lot of these issues, you tend to figure out what to do pretty quickly.
And John?
Thanks, Victor. Della Volpe is where I am on most social platforms. I have a new Substack. It's called JDV on Gen Z. So I have a lot of my research and insights there. And book is recently out in paperback, Fight, How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America.
Well, you heard it from all of the panelists directly. Go find them wherever they are. Go to Run for Something. Go to John's Substack. Go find, I guess maybe not Cam on social media, but find everything he's doing. And State Representative Syed is doing amazing work. I just want to thank everyone for being a part of this conversation. You all give me so much hope, and I know you give our audience so much hope as well. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. My name is David Pepper. I'm the former chair of the High Democratic Party, and I've written several books about the attacks on democracy at the state level in America, Laboratories of Autocracy, and a follow-up called Saving Democracy. And we're excited to be with you today. Our panel is about combating threats to democracy, and I'm honored to be with Ann Applebaum today, who also going to say a few words to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Ann Applebaum. I'm a writer for The Atlantic. I'm also a historian, mostly of the Soviet Union. I also wrote a book called Twilight of Democracy, which talks about the attraction of authoritarianism in the US, in the UK, in Poland, and in Hungary and elsewhere. I think it's a great topic for the two of us to discuss, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks. And it's a real honor to be with you. You've been raising the alarm bell for years about what's happening around the world, but also in our own country and the similarities. And I was really taken, as someone who's tried to draw some parallels between what's happening in states as well as the world and how they're similar or different. Your profile about Tennessee, I can't remember the name of the county, but one particular county in the broader politics of Tennessee. And the question I think your article asked was, is Tennessee even a democracy anymore? I'd love to hear you talk more about that. And also particularly, as you sit in Poland, I believe, watching what's happening there, when you look closely at Tennessee as you did, and you sort of explained it to the country, what were the similarities you're seeing in states like Tennessee, and Tennessee in particular, and some of the countries where we see really wheels coming off when it comes to democratic principles? Sort of similarities, differences, because I know you got into some of that in that wonderful story you wrote.
Sure. So the article was called, "Is Tennessee a Democracy?" And yes, it was slightly tongue in cheek. So in Tennessee, the Bill of Rights prevails. There is freedom of speech. The security services don't come into your house at 6 o'clock in the morning if you're a political dissident, at least not yet. You can move out of Tennessee if you don't like it there, and you can move to another state next door, and you'll still be an American citizen. And so of course it's it's not exactly, it's not, Putin's Russia. On the other hand, when you look at the mechanisms of democracy in Tennessee, and I mean here at the state level, when you look at how state elections work, when you look at how the state legislature works, you do see some echoes of the illiberal or illiberalizing democracies of Europe. So, you have a state legislature in which you now have a supermajority of Republicans, which is partially obtained by gerrymandering, also by different forms of voter suppression. There are a series of laws about voting in Tennessee, and if it was just one of them, you wouldn't say, well, that's illegal or that's bad. But when you have a lot of them put together, you can see how the laws are designed to make it difficult to vote. So it can be difficult for students to vote, for example. There's a rule about having to register 30 days in advance. It can be difficult to vote if you're outside of the state, and so on and so on. And the supermajority inside the state capitol also functions so that debate is controlled, and the Republican majority can cut off the microphones of Democratic speakers when they say things that they don't like. And they've passed various other rules to make it harder for them to speak and harder for them to say what they mean. And this all kind of came to a head a few months ago, following a really horrific school shooting in Tennessee at a private Christian school in Nashville. And 3 members of the Democratic Party in the state legislature got up and said, and during having been unable to speak and unable to talk about gun control, which, by the way, has a majority support in Tennessee, they used a break in the proceedings to say things they were unable to say on the floor. And the result of which was 2 of the 3 of them, 2 Black men, were suspended from the legislature. This is the famous 2 Justins. And they were both eventually reelected. But the problem was symptomatic of a state in which you now have the majority changing the rules so that it's harder for the minority to speak, it's harder for them to be heard, and you also have the effect of the changes is that to be elected even to the state legislature in Tennessee, you have to be pretty extreme, because the only people who matter in your voting district are other Republicans, and you have to beat out moderate Republicans in order to win. And so a series of changes in the way voting works means that the parliament, the parliament, there was a slip of the tongue, the state legislature is more extreme than the population. This is not so different from what happens in Hungary. It's not so different from what could happen here in Poland. We've got an election here in just over a week from now. And you also have small changes to the rules to make it easier for the ruling party to win. One of them, again, by itself might not be much, but when you have here, it's to do with funding, and state companies and state media run kind of propaganda which are paid for with taxpayers' money, run propaganda for the ruling party. But you also have these small changes to the electoral system designed to make it easier for people in rural Poland to vote and harder for people for example, outside the country to vote, also giving more weight to constituencies or, voting districts, that are rural as opposed to urban. So you have the same kind of pressure, when you have the ruling party changing the rules to tilt the playing field so that one side finds it easier to win. And in some cases, the other side finds it impossible to win. That's when you begin to ask, is it really a democracy anymore? And I do think that in Tennessee, we reached that moment where you can ask whether, this is really, does the state legislature represent the will of the people, and so on. David, I know that you've worked on exactly this subject. Your book, Laboratories of Autocracy, talked about the way this was being done in different states. I mean, do you want to start by talking about Ohio, where you were chair of the Democratic Party? And how, the other thing that interests me is how these ideas spread, including how they spread from Europe to the US. I mean, one illiberal leader, I mean, he's really an autocrat. He's really a dictator at this point. Viktor Orban, who's the prime minister of Hungary, actually comes to the US. He visited Tennessee. He's been to Florida, his people come to Florida. And he's trying to get people in the U.S. to copy his system, and you have adherents of his ideas at the state level of the U.S. Tell me about how it works in Ohio.
Sure. So when I wrote the book Laboratories of Autocracy, kind of like your title, I was sort of being edgy, but that's how a lot of these states are operating, not only in the directions they're going in, like Tennessee, but they really are operating as laboratories where they're always learning from one another. And the addendum I would make in that mindset as I laid out the book was they are learning from Orban. I mean, they CPAC goes to Hungary and it has a conference there. Tucker Carlson interviews him. Then he comes back to Austin and they celebrate him there. And in one way, I actually think that I wrote about this once. By studying and celebrating Orban, they're not only learning for the future, they're sort of legitimizing what they're already doing. Like, well, if it's happening over there and we say it's great, then what we're doing in our states here must be good also. So a couple of things. Ohio is, in a lot of the other states, very similar to Tennessee. I mean, one of the most striking parts of Tennessee, and I know you got into this in the article, right after the whole meltdown that we watched, I quickly got online and looked at, okay, how many of these Republicans in Tennessee who just did this even faced opposition in their last election? And the answer is almost 50% of them did not. And one of my theories in these states that are kind of locked up, gerrymandered, voter suppression, and then no opposition, and maybe in the end, that's the real moment where they get locked up. And you write about this, but the incentives of these places are completely warped from what we think about public service being. Once, and this is what's happening in Ohio and again, Missouri, Florida, once you literally have no opponent your next November, even when you're doing things as you've described that only 10 or 20% of the state agree with, the incentives really get turned upside down, where all of a sudden, if you're in a 50-50 district, and I was once a county commissioner in a 50-50 county, the incentive is to be mainstream. I mean, that's how you win the election. Being an extremist means you will lose. The incentive also is to do good public service, to show public outcomes, get reelected. But once you're in a system where you get reelected no matter what, all of a sudden there's no longer a connection between public outcomes and your reelection. That's very dangerous. And that's one reason you see not just extremism in these states, you see actually falling public outcomes. You see a corruption of public service where it really becomes, you're not really serving the public anymore. You're serving the private interests in the state house that want things. But the people back home can't stop you anyway. So you're not really serving improving those schools or those roads. Those public outcomes don't really matter. And so that 50% number in Tennessee is one other sort of 5-alarm fire that there's no accountability left. And that's when the incentives get screwed up. And that's a similar story to Ohio. It's, Oklahoma, it's 60% unopposed. Texas, Georgia, it's 40%. The other impact this has, by the way, and I guarantee this for Tennessee, most people have stopped paying attention. Their state legislatures, they're very anonymous. And a lot of it is because there's no opposition in the elections, which is the time where you'd have most attention. And that only makes the problem worse. The thing I'd say about some of these states that, again, gets to looking like other countries that you know better than I do, We also are starting to see a real rule of law problem, where we're getting to the point where there just are open violations of the rule of law that just go on. In Ohio, this is where sort of, I hate to say it, I'm a proud Ohioan. You know, I was once named most likely to be president of the Cincinnati Board of Tourism because I brag about Cincinnati. So I don't like running around the country saying my state is falling apart, but it is. In Ohio, we're starting to see just open violations of the law. You know, we're a state, and I worry this is going to be the next phase in other states too. It's already happening. We had a constitutional amendment to end gerrymandering in Ohio that passed by 70% of the vote twice in the late teens. The legislature simply ignored it. And then the Ohio Supreme Court, which, and this I think will be what sort of Orban style government is over there. When the legislature ignored, when the Supreme Court of Ohio, an independent court, independently elected, struck down the illegal maps, the legislature simply defied those orders for once, twice, 7 times. The legislature also changed the way we elect justices for the next election and ignored those rulings as long as they needed to get to the next election. They literally voted. Jim Jordan, who's being talked about for speaker right now, is sitting on a map of congressional districts in Ohio that violates the Constitution right now. And by delaying as long as they did, they were able to force a map on the primary ballot that violated the Constitution. And here's the sad part for Ohioans. It all worked. They were able to secure an unconstitutional map by defying a court long enough. And then they changed the rules of how we elect courts. So now they have a court that's partisan. They added party to the ballot and friendly towards them. So there's a sense of lawlessness. You know, there was a big issue in Ohio called Issue 1 that was going to change the threshold to 60% to amend the Constitution. That was passed. That was put on a day that actually violated the Ohio Revised Code. So the new sort of the next level beyond the extremism in these state houses, the lack of opposition, is they're pushing the envelope when it comes to just violating the law. And they are seeing, like Donald Trump has for years, they don't really face accountability for that. And that's, again, another, I think, red flag that we're starting to look like some of the worst of other countries. Back to this sort of laboratories analogy, though, do you see, so in states, literally, like when something works in one state that undermines democracy, a certain form of voter suppression, we see another state do it, et cetera, et cetera. Are you seeing that with countries as well, that like that Orban model isn't just being studied by American states, but that other countries are sort of mimicking things that look to be working in the wrong direction as far as we're concerned? Are they looking at leaders and saying, oh, we're going to do that as well?
Absolutely. I mean, it's you know, it works at a number of different levels. So first of all, Viktor Orban, who we've mentioned several times, I mean, this is his foreign policy. You know, his foreign policy is to sell and promote Hungarian-style autocracy in other countries. And he does this both in order to have compatible leaders in his region. He's just helped elect, they haven't formed a government yet, but a party in Slovakia that is a pro-Russian, anti-European, you know, a kind of illiberal political party. He helped them in all kinds of different ways with propaganda. He's accused of sending migrants to their border, you know, just a few days before the election in order to create a kind of fake migrant crisis. This is Slovakia, which is on the border of Hungary. And so he's very much interested in undermining the elections in his neighbors. He also has a big interest in creating, you know, sort of friendly people, friendly faces, friendly propagandists in the United States. He's spent a huge effort courting Tucker Carlson. You know, he gets Tucker Carlson to come to Budapest, which he did recently. In Budapest, Carlson does a hugely flattering interview with Orban. Orban then puts that on Hungarian television, which as a way, look, you know, the Americans support me. And and Carlson then uses, the Orbanist tactics, which are to always focus on the culture war and never talk about real issues. He's mimicked that way of doing politics, and he then brings it back to the United States. So some of this is deliberate. I mean, there's another level at which Vladimir Putin also does this. That's at a less open level, but he uses money, he uses bank loans, he uses also kind of anonymous trolling and online activities to try and flip elections all over Europe. And of course, he tried it in the US in 2016. The Russians have perfected this idea of, again, creating culture wars, playing up people's anger and fear, using that as a way to create support for anti-democratic, extremist, far right, and actually sometimes far left political parties as well. So this is a tactic not just at the level of other liberal democracies, but also at the level of real autocracies. I mean, this is a kind of, again, Russian foreign policy. A lot of it is about, how do we undermine the democratic world? Well, we do so through the use of propaganda and so on. So it's there is a kind of, I don't want to use the sort of ideological war makes it sound, I don't want this to sound like the Cold War, because it's not really like that. But there is a way in which the autocratic world has already targeted the democratic world, including the United States, and has already said, right, we're going to try and undermine those political systems. And we either go on pretending that either we don't know it, or we don't care, or they can't possibly be so powerful as to hurt us. And we're constantly surprised when the tactics that they've used nevertheless have an impact here. I would add one other to your very good description of how this works. I would add one other element. I appreciate what you said about rule of law in the United States. I would add one other element, which is the element of political violence. We are used to thinking, we imagine that, in democracy, you can make your case, you can campaign without fear. That's part of our political system. In Tennessee, I had somebody tell me, why don't Democrats run in rural Tennessee? Why are these Republicans all running unopposed? Why don't they have, counterparts? Well, one of the reasons is because the word Democrat in some parts of rural Tennessee equals pedophile. And people are afraid to be called pedophiles because someone might shoot them. I also had a journalist in Nashville who'd done a lot of really vigorous, reporting on particularly on the expulsion of the two men from the legislature, but also more broadly on the legislature. One night, someone came and shot up his house. He lives in a suburb of Nashville. Once that happens, that was, of course, designed to make him leave the country, go home, quit, find a new job. Once you begin to have those elements of political violence in public life, that also keeps good people out. It keeps people afraid. It also has a way of making politicians and political figures kind of toxic. So I should say here that I'm married to a Polish politician. He's not running in this current election. He's a member of something called the European Parliament. But he has death threats. He travels with security. He's campaigning, this week on behalf of his colleagues. It means that people we know would be afraid to be around him right now, and people stay away from us. And there is an effect that this threat of violence, or even just a really nasty smear campaign, can create a sort of a force field around you, whereby people are afraid to interact with you and so on. So these are, and I think autocrats understand that. That's why they do it. It's funny how the tactics of the smear campaign are also very similar across illiberal democracies and across autocracies, whether it's the Hungarian government, the Polish government, the Russian government, the Republican Party, the focusing on a single person, the trolling, the lies, the creation, as I said, of toxicity around somebody is also in some places an invitation to violence. And in the US, precisely because of our gun laws, it's particularly frightening. I mean, here in Poland, we had one political murder. We had the mayor of Gdańsk was the focus of exactly this kind of smear campaign from state media. And a guy who was released from prison, who'd been watching state media, got out of prison, walked up on a stage and knifed him. But, in the US, people have guns, and that's much easier to kill someone. And so that's also a new undertone in the US that we didn't have before. I mean, I'm sure you've seen that in your work as well.
Yeah. No, I do think, and the other big parallel besides other countries is this is very similar to how we had Jim Crow come out of the Civil War amendments and Reconstruction, and a key element was violence that accompanying every one of these sort of backlashes to a broader democracy is a set of tactics, a set of tools, voter suppression. But yeah, violence is sadly a part of it. And once you have other politicians, I've just been reading Stephen Levitsky's latest book, and once you have other politicians not stand up even to that, that's when it becomes more accepted, because other Republicans don't say anything about that violence, or as we see now with January 6th, sort of want to minimize it. That's when you really start to go in the wrong direction. I wanted to ask one other thing that I think is, because I'm very taken by the Orban United States analogy. A big thing that Orban has done is manipulate and interfere with the broad media, right? Can you talk to us about? And there's always, whenever I run around the country talking, people always bring up Fox News and right-wing radio. Talk to us about what Orban did when it came to the media there, and is that a precursor? Is that similar to some of what we're seeing here, or is that way beyond what we've seen in the United States?
So Orban, I mean, in Hungary and Poland and other European countries, we have the phenomenon of state media, which we don't have in the United States. So, in Poland, taking over the state television, which is like the main television station, something about a third of the country doesn't have any other TV. That means that kind of government propaganda is on TV all the time. You have to imagine a very extreme version, actually, of Fox News being taxpayer paid for media. And that's what you have in Hungary. You have something else as well, which is that he has created an advertising kind of ecosystem that means that only pro-government media finds it easy to get advertising money. And sort of pro-opposition media, became scared. Businesses who wanted to advertise in pro-opposition or even just independent neutral media were scared off doing that. So you could lose government contracts, you could lose revenue if you were seen to be advertising in non-pro-government media. In the case of Hungary and also in Poland, some of those media began to go bankrupt, and they were then purchased by businessmen, oligarchs essentially, who were close to the government. So they actually, in Hungary, the media is mostly owned, either it's owned directly by the state or it's owned indirectly by people or businesses who are somehow close to the ruling party. In Poland, that process isn't complete, but it's the same idea. I mean, we have a much bigger media market in the United States, but, can you imagine in the US and, maybe certainly at the state level, and maybe you can talk about this, when you could imagine, it being suddenly difficult for Warner Brothers to do certain kinds of deals, or, the owners of the New York Times might suddenly find some of their advertising drying up, if they were insufficiently supportive of the Trump presidency. I mean, you can imagine ways in which some of that could be replicated in the US. And I can also imagine that in smaller media markets, in the United States, buying up all the local papers or buying up all the local, TV channels could also create this phenomenon that you have here, which is that there are parts of the general public who really don't see anything else at all. I mean, they only see, kind of pro-regime media, and even when they see the something else, even when they have access to the internet, which again, some people here don't. The fact that the same message is coming from, the most important television station, the most important local newspaper, and then maybe there's something on the internet that says it's not true, it gives a tilted and twisted view of the world. So I can imagine that becoming a problem in parts of the United States too.
Well, yeah, when I think about it, one thing I really push on is the dying of local in-state media. is now a huge sort of factor in these state houses becoming laboratories of autocracy. There's almost no transparency. You know, a lot of state house bureaus of major cities are cut. The local paper that would give you any sense of what that local smaller town paper, let's say, that local state rep is doing, also gone. And so that ends up meaning that Fox News is even the more dominant media platform in a lot of these places. But by the way, what you just described, I don't want to get carried away here, but it's when you see Elon Musk take over Twitter, and all of a sudden we've got all this, disinformation, Musk himself, it sounds a little bit like that. I don't want to leave folks, by the way, with total hopelessness. I think, as you said, and I try and write about and talk about, the most important thing, if this is something that troubles all of us, is to make sure everyone's aware of this. And one of my biggest fears is that we have been going through, and it's changing lately, and we're seeing results of that change. We've been going through, decades where we've in America taken democracy for granted. We can't have what happened in Hungary happen here. We're America, after all. Didn't the Voting Rights Act protect us from all this? And I think that blind spot is the danger, that there are these incredibly dangerous things happening that are very similar to other countries, are very similar to got Jim Crow. And so a lot of what I try and do is just simply, although I sound like I'm somewhat negative, wake people up that this can happen, and it is happening, and the similarities, including that sense and atmosphere of violence, are real. But on the more positive side, I'd love to hear what you're seeing in other countries. I'll just mention here, once people wake up to it, we actually are seeing some fight back. And this has become especially clear since Dobbs. There have been numerous sort of, I would call them, democracy battles in states for the past year. One, Kansas, last August, special election, post-Dobbs. You had election denied. Who won? In Kansas, those fighting for a woman's right to choose. Last November, you had almost every election-denying Secretary of State candidate lose in swing states across the country. The voters saw that as a threat to democracy. They rallied, and in all these states where Democrats are supposed to lose in the midterm because we have the White House, well, the election deniers actually lost. Mastriano lost. Lake lost by more than the other people on their ticket. And then, of course, we had a Wisconsin Supreme Court special election, and then you had the Ohio issue one in August. So I think the message is, and there could be some point that you'll tell us it's so locked up, it's truly hard for the people to even stop it. But in America, one of my themes is it's not too late, folks. We are seeing a winning streak for democracy occur. We're in the middle of it when people have seen a threat at a state level and shown up and voted. So that to me underscores why it's so important that people see this, understand it, and when there are moments to fight back through your vote and lawsuits and everything, they actually can still succeed. I don't know if you're seeing models, and in other places where there's also been that kind of fight back. I'd love to hear what you think. What are some of the steps that you think are being taken anywhere that are successful? Because there has been sort of a path of hope in the last year in America that I hope people are wise enough to continue.
No, I completely agree. I mean, the point of everything that I do is to shock people out of the complacency that you described. For a really long time, we thought, democracy was something like tap water, it just comes out of the wall. You don't have to think about where it comes from, put a glass under the tap and drink it. And I think now we're starting to understand that, no, it's like water in a well, like someone has to get up. Sometimes you have to go and get it. You can't trust some professional politicians to run your democracy for you. You might have to participate yourself. You might have to give money. You might have to do, work at the polls during the election. You might have to, organize something in your own neighborhood. I mean, I'm not saying everybody has to be a candidate, although I hope good people will be. But everybody is a citizen, and everybody can and should take some responsibility for what happens in their country. Here in this election in Poland, one of the ways the opposition, which is really three parties, has been campaigning is to stage some really big public meetings. There was an enormous march last weekend. It was probably the largest march demonstration ever to take place in the city of Warsaw, as far as we know, ever. I mean, it's hard to say exactly how many people, but it looks upwards of 500,000, maybe closer to 1 million. taking up all the entire space, over a kind of, 5-mile stretch over wide roads in the middle of the city. And motivating people to come to that, to do that, to turn out, to make the event cheerful, which it was. Everybody carried, the Polish flag. Some people carried European flags. There was music, and to remind us that, all of us can physically take part, and then all of us can then go back to wherever it is that we come from, work on the election campaign, be part of the election monitoring teams, which we have here, and then, of course, vote and get people to vote. And so motivating people and finding ways to remind people that they are responsible for what happens in their country, and that, that the government isn't something that's far away, that you don't have any impact over, but that you can make an impact somehow too, I think is ultimately what should be, all of our messages.
Yeah, and I'll just say, and I know we have to close, but I'll say that the reason, back to your article about Tennessee and why I focus on Ohio, is when we have, and I always say, yeah, we throw democracy into the mom apple pie in baseball. Like, it's just part of America when it needs to be fought for. It's not there automatically. But the other thing I think that really disempowers Americans is we leave the sense that democracy is only a battle in swing states for the Electoral College or the U.S. Senate. And that means people in Tennessee or Ohio or California or New York, they think, well, I'm sorry that democracy is falling apart, but I'm not in a swing state. I can't do anything about it. And the answer actually is the attack on democracy is in all these states. It's at the state legislative level. That's where the focus is, which is sobering. But it also means wherever you live in this country, you're on the front line, because it's in your state house. It's in the fact that 50% of Tennessee Republicans weren't challenged. So let's get to work, although it's challenging, solving that. It's in the purging of millions of voters in Ohio and Georgia. So let's get to work getting those voters back on the rolls. So not only can we all fight for democracy, we don't only have to fight for it in some faraway swing state. We're on the front lines wherever we are. The Koch brothers know that. The legislators know that. We have to know it. And when we see that, the truth is, as you said, there is so much more we could all be doing once we see not only the stakes of democracy itself and not a few federal seats, but also that we are on the front lines, because that's where it's being attacked. So, and it was a real honor speaking with you. I've been a fan for years. You've been sounding the alarm, and I think people are starting to wake up, which is the good news in some pretty sobering times.
Thank you so much, and thanks for all your great books and for the great work that you do. I really appreciate being part of this conversation.
Thanks, everybody.
Welcome to the 92nd Street Y's latest edition of the State of America. And today we're going to be talking about the urban and rural political divide. It's sharp, it's real, and it's not just here. It's something that we're seeing all over the world. With me, I've got three of the most distinguished panelists that we can expect on a topic like this. We'll be joined with Catherine Kramer, the Natalie C. Holton Chair of Letters and Science, and the Virginia Shapiro Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and the author of Politics of Resentment, a study of rural Republican political efforts to tap into rural voters' beliefs in the state of Wisconsin. We'll be joined by Christina Ball-Owens, the Executive Director of PublicWise, a organizing group who has been working to organize and inform rural voters and rural communities. And we will be joined by Manuel Pastor, Distinguished Professor of Sociology and American Studies and Ethnicity at the Dornsife School at the University of Southern California. He's the author of many, many books, including Equity, Growth, and Community, What the Nation Can Learn from America's Metro Areas. Thank you all for joining me and the 92nd Street Y on this informative panel. Catherine, I wanted to start a little bit with you, which is just starting with a description of what is this divide? I know people who study it look at maps and they can see it, but what is the urban-rural political divide in the United States, and how deep is it?
Well, in general, what people are talking about is this increasing and pretty strong correlation between partisanship and place in the United States, so that rural areas are tending to vote for Republican candidates and more urban areas are tending to vote for Democratic candidates. But I think the power of it is that it's not just a situation in which certain types of people live in certain types of places. In my understanding, there's sentiments in both rural and urban places that are leaning people towards the political parties, in addition to occupational, educational, income, racial differences. And I think it is, as you say, it's pretty deep. And in many respects, it's been a long time coming. It isn't just a recent phenomenon, although I would argue Republican politicians have done a very good job of tapping into sentiments of feeling left behind and such in rural areas. So we're more aware of it since the 2016 presidential election, for sure. But it also sometimes gets overplayed. And I think there's a lot more variation in attitudes among urban populations as there is among rural populations than sometimes this simple sense of the rural-urban divide conveys.
And well, you study urban areas. So what have you seen over the last 10 to 20 years that have been a directional movement for urban voters to perhaps become more supportive of Democratic Party candidates than they might have been, say, in the era of George W. Bush and John Kerry?
There's a couple of different factors that I think are really important in this. Kathy was pointing out they're not completely confined to place, although place makes a difference. First is the concentration of economic activity in urban cores of metropolitan areas. And I think that's been very significant. And if you take a look, for example, at the vote, I think it's about 75% of GDP growth was concentrated in the metro areas that wound up voting for Biden, a little bit higher, actually, than it was voting for Clinton. So one thing is that these have been the centers of economic activity. They've also tended, partly because of that, to attract two types of folks: people of color who are trying to make their way in a new economy, and more college-educated whites. And in a study that we did with Ron Brownstein of both The Atlantic and CNN, there's been an increasing polarization. It's Democratic and Republican political camps based on whether or not your area has a lot of college-educated whites and a lot of people of color. So that kind of overlaps with urban-rural, but it actually has a lot to do with economic activity, with the fact that that economic activity is supported by diversity, bringing people from all over the world to contribute to economic activity. And that tends to wind up leaning Democratic, and it creates a sense in the areas that are being left behind, whiter, less educated, more rural, that they are being deliberately left behind in this economy.
Well, Christina, when you PublicWise does its work, what do the people from these areas that you go into tell you? You know, how do they express their feelings when you try and ask them about what's motivating them and how they feel about their communities and their relationship to the national or perhaps even the state and local governments?
So I want to start by saying PublicWise actually works with both urban and rural voters. We fielded a national survey of voters in both urban and rural areas to look specifically at the differences, especially in views of accountability in government, but also on views like abortion, whether or not Trump won the 2020 election, and issues like that. It was more common for rural voters to think that Trump won the 2020 election. It was more common for people, and I think this was actually both in urban and rural areas, it fell along party lines, whether or not people thought that insurrectionists involved in January 6th should be held accountable. We did see that there were moderate voters who felt like there was a bridge too far for January 6th participants and rioters if they helped, if there were elected officials or sitting elected officials that helped the rioters plan in advance and gain access. We did see that across the board, that moderates did think also that those folks should be held accountable. But we also saw some surprising things. You know, it was more likely for an urban voter to support abortion rights, but we did see that 50.7% of rural voters also believe that abortion should be legal at least in some point in a pregnancy. So what we have taken away from this as a group that supports organizing and funds organizing of voters of color, of what we call the new American electorate, which does include urban and rural voters, is that there is an underinvestment in rural voters and also in finding out the opinions of rural voters. And it's especially important no matter what side of the political spectrum you fall on, because rural voters have an outsized effect on the outcome of the presidential election based on the current structure of the Electoral College. So rural voters are actually more expensive to talk to than urban voters. It is much cheaper to knock on doors in an apartment building in the Bronx than it is to drive door to door in a rural community in Georgia. However, those voters in Georgia, one, deserve to be outreached to, deserve that kind of education, but also have an outsized effect on the election. So if you are pro-choice, for example, there are, let's do the math really quick, 49.3% of voters in rural areas that support your cause. And those are voters that should be invested in and contacted. Same for the other side, right? There's 50.7, but we're finding underinvestment in these communities. And our work at PublicWise is we are funding groups like Down Home, North Carolina, or Fair Count, who make it their mission to speak to less contacted rural voters.
So, Catherine, you spent a lot of time in Wisconsin during the Scott Walker years, trying to understand what the symmetry was between these rural and small town voters who, if you go back and take a look, these are places that voted for John Kerry, they voted for Al Gore, many of them voted for Barack Obama, but starting with 2010, they became the base of Republican Party success in Wisconsin. What did you find resonated among them? Why were they attracted to people like Scott Walker and then eventually transferring that support to people like Donald Trump?
I think in general it was this sense of a way of life had been lost and they were struggling economically, and recognizing changes in American society that bewildered them, and in some cases felt as though it was a threat to their own status. Obviously in Wisconsin, I'm talking here about predominantly white folks, although there's certainly a significant population of people of color in Wisconsin too, as we have 11 national or federally recognized tribes here. But among the white folks, cultural change in terms of racial and ethnic change was part of the story too. But just generally, it was a sentiment of whatever government's been doing is not working for people like us. And so why should we believe a politician, namely Democratic-leaning, Democratic Party candidates, who come in here and tell us that what we need is another government program? We don't see past government programs working for us. And, those are perceptions. It's important to recognize it. In some cases, government programs had been doing great things for some of these communities, but the perception was we're just not getting our fair share of attention from existing government. And honestly, I think it's important to recognize that they weren't enamored with the Republican Party either. But Scott Walker and Donald Trump, in a different way, but in his own way, basically said, you're right to be so upset, and I'm going to give you a target of blame. And in Scott Walker's case, he held up public employees in the government and said, they're getting way more than they deserve, and you deserve more. Vote for me, and I'll fix that. Donald Trump gave people different targets of blame, but similarly said, you're right to be so upset, and vote for me, and I'm on your side. And, both appeals were pretty effective at tapping into this sense that things are just not working for people like me or in places like my community.
Obviously, Manuel, one of the things that happens is you can't, even in a world of narrowcasting, cable television, and the fragmentation of media, people eventually find out what one side is saying to another. So the sort of things that will rally the rural voters that Catherine was talking about will be heard by the urban voters. Is that sort of rallying one of the reasons why urban areas have moved to the Democratic Party, is that they hear a message of left behind and fair share and cultural change is bad, and voters look around and say, actually, it's working for me. And they become more likely to move towards the Democrats because they say, if this is what if the Republicans represent this group of people, that's not me. Maybe this other party represents me.
Well, I think it's really important to stress the role of demographic change, as Kathy was just pointing out. In urban areas, I live in Los Angeles. We became majority people of color in 1987, 1988. Apparently, it's working out for us. California, 1999. The demographic change in California between 1980 and 2000 is the demographic change the United States is going through between 2000 and 2050. In many ways, California was America fast forward, and that period of rapid demographic change in California was filled with lots of racial tension, attacks on undocumented immigrants, elimination of bilingual education, elimination of affirmative action, etc. I think for many rural areas, there is a sense that this, as Kathy was saying, the country is changing. Maybe they're not included, but also change is arriving at their doorstep. We tend to think about the rural areas as being almost entirely white, but rural America is more than a quarter people of color. And there's been pretty rapid growth, particularly of Latino immigrants who wound up becoming a demographic lifeline for a lot of industries that need new workers. Meat packing, certainly agriculture, etc. So I think that upfront demographic change also leads to a little bit of fear. Now, on the other hand, I think for the first time, also urban voters are, and this gets to the divide that will exist, are becoming aware that red states, for example, are net takers from the federal government. Blue states are net givers to the federal government in terms of the fiscal flow. It's very similar for a lot of our rural urban areas as well, because again, it's the urban areas that have become the economic engines. And while there's a lot of poverty there, there's also a lot of wealth, professional middle-class people who are paying high taxes into the federal government. And so it's being set up to not just of rural resentment of urban America, but of urban America leaning back and saying, why exactly are you so resentful when so many resources are in fact headed in your direction? And when the demographic change urban America has been through is actually not that frightening when you get to the end of it.
So, Christina, part of the theory of the new American electorate is persuasive, in the sense that you need to make arguments. Part of it is demographic, which is that there's simply this rising tide of people who lean in a particular direction, and that eventually there will be this urban-dominated, but not urban-centric majority that will put this 50-50 divide to the side. And Rui Teixeira, a progressive political analyst, has argued that people who are want to support this movement need to focus more on the persuasion and less on the simple demography, because, as he regularly says, working class people of color, particularly Latinos, and working class whites are put off by some of the cultural issues that elements of the new American electorate are pushing. Do you have any particular view on that, or does your survey cast any light on that argument that maybe to build this new American electorate that is more than 50% of America, you need to emphasize the economics more than the culture as you go forward?
So if I'm understanding the question, it's really, I should say that for us, the definition of new American electorate does include rural voters, because they're a group that has been under-resourced in the voting space and that have not been reached out to as much. I would say, and going back to a comment that Kathy made, that I think we'd be hard-pressed to find anyone in either urban or rural spaces that feel like the government is working for them right now. I think we'd be hard-pressed to find a voter that's like, everything's great. I really support the way that this government is right now. And I think this is where we find common ground. And, part of PublicWise is we're looking at long-term change and building out the electorate as a whole. We do understand that there is a concentration right now in outreach in urban spaces, but also, I should point out that in my experience in organizing, the urban and rural divide is not just state by state, it's within state. So if you're looking at change within state government, I mean, my first experience working with rural voters was the New York State Rural Democratic Caucus, right? Because they felt like the statewide government was not serving them. I would also say that a lot of the Progressive Caucus felt like the state government wasn't serving them. So I think there is a commonality in how we're communicating with these folks. I think a lot of these voters across both sides care about accountability. They care about a government that's actually representative of them. I think, there's a lot of these voters who care about seeing themselves in government. So seeing someone who comes from a rural background hold office, that is not as common. I think it's probably as uncommon as seeing a person of color, represent them in office. So I think there's a lot of commonalities here that building civic participation and building out the electorate, there's a lot of commonalities in how we're talking to both sides of these. There's just different levels in who's being talked to and how they're being invested in. And that's something at PublicWise that we're trying to even out.
You talked a little bit about common ground, Christina. Give me some examples of things that your experience or your data say, beyond the abortion rights that you mentioned, where you can say, hey, here's a significant part of rural voters who may not be voting Democratic right now, and here's a significant number of overvoters who also may not be voting Democratic right now, but there's actually an issue convergence or a way of life convergence that they can see themselves in, and that if people emphasize more, maybe they could start to heal this divide. Do you have some examples of things like that?
I mean, this brings me to our research actually on non-voters. So in 2020, we saw across the country record turnout. There was more ways than ever to vote. Vote by mail became more common. Early voting became more common. And we wanted to look at why there were still some people who chose not to vote. So we did focus groups in battleground states. So again, that included both urban and rural voters. And one of the themes that was common across all of those folks when we asked them, why did you choose not to vote, was the lack of accountability in election administration. So of course, the sentence did not come out that way. What it came out as was, I take time off of work, maybe I lose pay, maybe I don't. I take time away from my family, and I cast my vote, and then I find out that my vote didn't count anyway. I find out it got thrown out somehow. So why should I keep doing this? The government doesn't look like me, it's not serving me, and my vote might not even count. So I'm not wasting my time. And so we found that accountability and election administration, as in the weeds, and maybe if you talk to someone about that in that language, they'll probably zone out. But if you talk about actually having your voice heard, casting your vote and making your time worth it, looking at, whether or not elections are fairly held, both sides are using the same kind of language. They're both saying that elections are fixed or rigged, right? They might mean different things when they're saying that, but there is a commonality in the fear of how fair our elections are, on how much how many votes are actually being counted. And then the other side that we saw was that people just felt like voter outreach was super transactional, right? So you're only talking to me when you need my vote, especially in a battleground state. I mean, people who are holding up entire forests of mail, right, that they get in the 3 weeks up to elections, but you never ask me in an off year how I'm doing or what is affecting me. So we purposely fund groups that are working through their voter universes in quote off years to ensure that civic engagement is year round, and to ensure that all kinds of voters know that the person you elected in should be hearing from you and should hear what your concerns are. I think we all care about the economy. Infrastructure comes up across political divides, across rural or urban voters. And these are things that people need to know that they have the ability to talk about and to reach out and try to create change in.
I mean, well, what sorts of examples has your research brought to your attention that suggests there might be something that these sides can agree on, even if they continue to disagree on many other things?
Well, I want to pick up on one question you asked Christine as well, which is about the sort of economics versus cultural issues aspect of this. And while I do think that leaning too heavily on what some term cultural issues can alienate voters, I think the real question is, do you ignore or do you inoculate in the face of racism? Meaning that there's a strategy that says, let's not talk about the demographic change that's causing anxiety in the country. Let's not talk about racism and how it persists in the country. Let's not talk about this discomfort. Let's just focus in on the economy, and maybe that will bring people together. I actually think what's much better is to try to bring it into the conversation in a way that helps people talk about their anxiety, about their discomfort, helps them work through it. Now, part of that, and it does get at research, is what Christina is talking about, which has a term, integrated voter engagement, which means that rather than just doing a get out the vote kind of helicopter operation in an election year, that you make sure that you're doing integrated voter engagement in off years, which helps to get people involved in civic activity, developing a habit of being involved civically, and helps to motivate new and occasional voters. That's actually been key in California in terms of political change. It was one of the secrets in Georgia in the elections in 2020 that not only tipped that electorate to Biden, but we ended up electing two of the most liberal senators in the Senate from Georgia. But a lot of that had to do with integrated voter engagement. And it had to do with one other thing that we're not talking about much, which is suburban voters. Because between urban and rural is the suburb. And these suburbs are actually where most of the demographic change in the United States is occurring. It's where issues like poverty are actually dramatically on the rise. And it's a place where the contestation is actually, I think, the most sharp between the parties.
So, Catherine, since you wrote your book, Wisconsin remains a 50-50 state, but Scott Walker lost his election in 2018 to Tony Evers. Tony Evers was reelected, even though you have the urban-rural distinction has remained sharp. Obviously, something changed in a way that made it possible for Democrats to win statewide and in your state. What is it that they did that maybe brought a couple of people on board and created, if not a super majority coalition, at least a 50 to 55% coalition that Evers and Tammy Baldwin and almost Mandela Barnes could tap into?
I don't know for sure, but I think one part of the equation is that Wisconsin is such a closely divided state and that our elections are won by very thin margins here. Like presidential elections, the last was, between 20 and 22,000 votes. But I think my sense is that it has to do with some of the things that Christina was emphasizing and Manuel as well, as like the careful relationship building and listening that politicians of any stripe need to do in order to make people feel respected and heard, and not just in election season, right? And I think that there are a variety of issues that appeal to people across partisan background and place. And for example, just in the economic realm, things like living wage, affordable housing, public transportation, low-cost banking, deconcentrating economic power. I mean, these are things that this commission that I've been co-chairing for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences has settled on as things that will help all people thrive. And there are also things that a left-leaning, rural-focused advocacy organization named the Rural Urban Bridge Initiative has identified as things that will help rural areas thrive as well. So insofar as those are things that the Evers campaign and Tammy Baldwin has emphasized, they do play well with rural folks as well as with urban folks. And I think it just goes back to some of our opening comments about how this is a real divide. And yet there are things that concern Americans of a wide variety of backgrounds. And as Christina said, like a wide variety of us don't think government in general is working for us right now. And there are some pretty basic things that resonate really strongly with rural folks as well as urban folks. And, these things that I've mentioned in terms of basic economic policies that would help people make ends meet at a minimum.
We only have a couple of minutes left, so I'd like to just kind of lead with one question, and that is the Latino community. That the Latino community is the fastest growing ethno-demographic community in the United States, maybe slightly slower in a percentage term than the Asian community, but certainly it starts from a much larger base. It's present in urban areas. It's increasingly becoming present in large suburban areas and rural areas. I was in northwestern Iowa, which is the area with the largest concentration of Dutch immigrants in the United States. And you go into these cities and you see Guatemalan restaurants and Mexican restaurants because 10 to 15% of these cities are new immigrants from Latin America. What are the issues that these voters and these people, both current voters and non-voters, Christina, are thinking of, and in what way can each of these urban or rural-dominated red-blue coalitions be said to have appeal for either of them? Are they really up for grabs, or are they ultimately going to be aligned, regardless of their place of residence, with an urban-dominated coalition? Christina, why don't we start with you?
What I will say is that I think the biggest mistake we can make here is to view the Latino vote as a monolith. In beyond urban, rural, there is many different ethnicities. There's language differences. There's differences of born here and born abroad. I just think it's a question that can't be answered in a way where we can sort of wrap up in a bow what we should be doing, because it is such a large community that is spread throughout the community and growing rapidly. And we really need to look area by area, age group by age group. And this is what makes it hard and what makes it expensive. And why looking at things like cost per vote is not the best metric, and looking at if you're actually making change and growing the electorate.
Manuel?
Well, Christina said a lot, thank you, which means I don't have to cover some of that in terms of the diversity of the population and the need for specific outreach. I would say a couple things. One is there's a new great poll that LA Times helped do, looking at the immigrant community and basically saying, if you're looking for the American dream, talk to immigrants, because they have a sense of optimism, of hope, of the fact that they may and their children may be able to make it in this country. So I think it's very important when you're talking to the Latino community to talk about a way of inspiring hope, talking about the future, talking about the economy. I think the Republicans have a chance. Certainly the Democrats have made more inroads. I think the one thing that's crucial is that if you're threatening to deport someone's grandmother, you're probably not going to be able to make tremendous inroads into the community. So we'll see whether or not the GOP can get its act together. We just saw a debate last night in which the main folks would not even talk about Dreamers, DACA kids, and their ability to stay in the country. I think if there could be some repair on that set of issues around immigration, the Republicans could make big inroads around an economic message, a family message, a cultural message.
Catherine, last words with you.
Well, thanks. I will say just briefly, I think where to look is within Latino communities themselves and the kind of activism and action that's going on through advocacy organizations. And I say that based on learning I've done through a graduate student in our program by the name of Kenya Coronado, who's been just looking at the way that advocacy organizations within Latino communities have been providing basic things. We often look at what the national presidential campaigns, for example, are doing to organize people and who's making the most inroads with the Latino population. But given the things that we've just said in the past half hour about the importance of relationships and political parties and campaigns kind of spending time with people outside election cycles, I think the real action is being done within communities themselves. And it's, dealing with surveillance and lack of healthcare, underfunded schools, those types of things seem to really be significantly meaningful to people in many Latino communities.
Catherine, Manuel, Christina, thank you very much for an informative and enlightening conversation. And I'd like to thank the 92nd Street Y for bringing us together and for sponsoring this recent edition of the State of America panel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our conversation today on Latinx voters and the upcoming election. I'm Madi Bolaños, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. We have some pretty great people here to discuss the history, present, and future of Latinx voters in the United States. Chuck Rocha is president of Solidarity Strategies, and Gerardo Cadava is professor of History of Latino and Latina Studies at Northwestern University. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Gerardo, I want to start with you. It seems like in the last few elections, Latinx communities are constantly having to remind people that we are not a monolithic group. That being said, what shifts have you seen in Latinx voters in the last decade?
That's a great question. It's true. It is odd that we always have to remind people that we're not a single block of voters. That's something we've known for a long time, really, but yet it seems to, at least in the popular media and a non-Latino understanding of things, always needs to be reiterated. I think that, whether we go back a decade, 5, 6, 7 years ago, the shift that most people have paid attention to was the shift from the Democratic Party toward the Republican Party incrementally. I mean, we're not talking about landslides. We don't know that it's continuing. We don't know that I doubt it will be a majority, but the incremental shift from Democrats to Republicans. And we were surprised that Donald Trump, despite everything he did and said between 2016 and 2020, marginally improved his performance from 28% to 38%, which is significant for sure. That's a significant move, and we're still talking about it, thinking about it, debating it, wondering whether it's going to happen again, wondering whether a Republican who's not Donald Trump could duplicate it. So I think there are a lot of open questions, but I think that was the kind of most important shift over the past 10 years.
And how have you seen that reflect in the voting patterns and turnout most recently?
I mean, it's been interesting that, I think turnout among Latinos has been up in the past couple of election cycles. I mean, more Latinos are voting than ever before, but the kind of shift happened nonetheless. So I don't know if it's about, there's always a question about who's eligible, what percentage of eligible voters turn out. And, the electorate's constantly changing. What surprises me as a historian is despite all of the shifts, the increasing numbers of voters, the real changes in the party, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party over the past 30 or 40 years, what's remarkable to me is the kind of relative stability of the Latino vote for Democrats and Republicans over a really long period of time. So I think more Latinos are voting. They're more energized by politics now. I would expect that to continue. Everyone knows that it's a younger electorate. More and more Latinos register to vote and can turn out to vote all the time. And so I think that trend will continue, and we'll see if that makes a difference in the results.
And this question can be for both of you, but why do you think it's a younger electorate that's coming out to vote?
I'll let you start with that, Chuck.
Well, it's just,
that's
right. Let the young man get in here and talk with all the white hair on his face. It's just demographics. We're a younger demographic all the way around. For example, if you take the average age of a Latino voter in America, it's 27. The average age of a Black or white voter in America is in their early 40s. That's just a difference of the age of the population in the United States. Yeah. It also harkens back to what Jerry just said about turnout. People have liked to say that Latinos don't show up and we don't show up at the same numbers. Think about what I just said about our average age. And if you look at the average turnout of 27-year-olds compared to the average turnout of 40 and 50-year-olds, you will see a significant difference. And that's been more of a driving factor. And then you couple on language, where they live, a lack of outreach, cultural competency. And then you start seeing that gap between a turnout between a Latino voter or a Black and white voter.
And Chuck, in 2020, wasn't it up to something like 60%? I think it had been like 47, 48%, and then it was 60% in 2020.
We have seen a gigantic jump since Donald Trump has been in, and it kind of started before Donald Trump with Barack Obama, is when you really started seeing, but you also, again, I give Barack Obama and I give Donald Trump both lots of credit here. but it's really the changing of the demographic, the changing of the space where lots more people, there's a lot more TV channels, there's the internet. I know we'll get to all of this stuff, but the demographic has really, really changed in a quick time because these young second and third generation Latinos who are English dominant are getting more information. They're getting more civically involved. And then when there's a transformational candidate, either on the left with Barack Obama or on the right with Donald Trump, you see spikes in turnout.
Mm-hmm. Chuck, I want to ask you, what have candidates gotten wrong about Latinx voters in the last few years?
How much time do we got?
30 minutes, I think.
I mean, a lot. Let's start with some basics. The first is they think Latino voters, who are in fact people of color, are the same as Black voters in the way that they should show up and talk to them and just consider them what we call in the profession a turnout universe instead of a persuasive universe. So that means they probably don't talk to us to the very end of the campaign, and they're just trying to shuffle us out to go vote or to vote early because they assume, the Democrats that is, assume that Latinos are going to vote for them at 70%, which is just not true anymore. So that's the first mistake, is that we are not African-American or AAPIs, and targeting voters of color and not segmenting them is a huge mistake. The next mistake they make is they assume that we're all Mexican. Now, in fact, over 60% of all the Latinos in America are, in fact, from Mexican descent. But when you're talking to all the Latinos in one state, like Pennsylvania, over 80% of those are from two places, Puerto Rico or the Dominican Republic. So you have to have culturally competent campaigns. Sure, everybody's running around talking about we in a monolith, but that's true. But that's the second mistake we make, is they used to show up at every Latino event with tacos and sombreros thinking everybody was a Mexican. So that's the second mistake. And then the third mistake is I could list 15, but I'll stop at 3 so the professor can jump in here. But the other mistakes I think they make is they don't expand their target list. That means normally we just talk to prime voters who have a history of showing up in an election. And because we're such a younger demographic, you need a longer period of time to have a conversation with people whose parents probably just recently immigrated here from a turmoiled country like Venezuela or Colombia or somewhere like that, where you need to explain to them what a Democrat is or what a Republican is and what you're going to do to make their life better, and not just show up in the last 6 weeks and think they're going to show up to vote for you.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to what Chuck said is kind of a matter of geography, where I think for the longest time we've assumed that, it's a reality of our electoral system that the election is going to be decided in kind of a handful of states, right? And, Texas, I don't even know if Florida is going to be a battleground anymore. We'll see. But then Georgia, Wisconsin, and when Arizona, for sure, when you think about those states, like from a Latino lens, you kind of think that Arizona is a Mexican state, Florida is a Cuban state. What else? Wisconsin's full of Mexican immigrants, those kinds of things. And so you think about those states in kind of single terms, but man, I can't stop myself from going back to Florida, even though it might not be a battleground now. But if you think of Florida as like the Cuban state, well, things change in Florida, and so there are a bunch of Puerto Ricans in Florida now. There are a bunch of Venezuelans. There are a bunch of Colombians. And so, it's not the case that you can think that the Latino vote in a particular place means one group of voters. Even within states, the Latino vote is kind of really differentiated. And I think something campaigns haven't yet gotten, I'm talking like I'm the expert. I mean, when it comes to campaigns, ask Chuck this question. But, I think campaigns don't understand, perhaps because it's a limited resources or something like that, but they don't understand that everywhere they go across the country, they are talking to Latinos, whether it's Washington or Oregon or Pennsylvania or anywhere. The kind of number of Latinos that live in many of these closely contested states is going to be larger than the margin of victory. So they can make a real difference. And just look at places like Oregon and Washington, which, we have new Latino Congress people elected in those places in 2022. So I think Latinos are shaping politics in many, many places.
Basically, we're everywhere.
We're everywhere. Get used to it.
Yeah.
Kind of always have been, but we're now even more everywhere.
Totally. Chuck, you'd mentioned that, campaigns tend to focus on Latinx voters towards the end of their campaign. Is that changing more recently? What have you seen in this election?
Yes, and it just started changing abruptly. I want to go back to what the professor said about the spike of Latinos moving from Democrats to Republicans in the 2020 presidential race. It levels out in 2022. It doesn't go back. It doesn't revert back, but it levels out. And let me explain that just for a minute, and I'll answer your question. There were big spikes in like Miami-Dade and the Texas Valley, spikes of double digits, sometimes 20 points. In other places, there was only a 2-point jump or a 4-point jump. But the Catalyst Institute, who studies and tracks all this, says it was on average of 8 points all the way across. And so because you have these spikes, you just see folks wanting to do something about that. So it was a wake-up call for Democrats. And what I want to get to is in the last off-year election, which was the election we just had, where there wasn't a presidential election, just congressional Senate races for all of you listening, there was more money spent in Spanish language advertising by Democrats than had ever been spent in the history of off-year elections to Latinos. Now, do all Latinos listen to Spanish? And is that an indicator? It is very much an indicator, but it doesn't tell the whole story, but it's something you can measure over time of when they used to spend money in Spanish and they just blew it out of the water because guess what? They were like, oh my God, we lost 8 points. We got to get that back because you cannot win a House seat or a Senate seat or the presidency in most of these states if you underperform the average Latino performance to a Democrat. You just can't win. And to make my case even stronger, because this is what I do every day, is the Biden campaign and the Biden super PAC. What are we looking at here? It's October the 5th. I just looked at my watch. And already the Biden campaign and the Biden super PAC are up in Spanish language radio and TV in Arizona and Nevada over a year before the election. Now, 20 years ago, that advertising didn't happen but 4 to 6 weeks before the election, if we were lucky. It's happening.
Heritage Month.
Right. Exactly. Now it's over a year out and they're running ads to talk about what they've done. That proves, and it may not fix their problem. It may be much deeper than that. But just as an indicator, this shows that something is happening that's different and somebody got a wake-up call.
Right. I want to focus on priorities. What are Latinx voters' priorities coming in this upcoming election?
Go ahead, Jerry.
I mean, I think we could begin and end with talking about the economy, I think, and jobs and security. I think in that respect, Latinos aren't all that different from any other American. I think one thing I'm very curious to see is it's clear from the Republican end of things that immigration and the border are going to be just massive subjects for them. I mean, they're talking about how we should invade Mexico, and that's kind of like the mainstream position. Everyone, you can go down the line, and all of the Republican candidates support that position, and that's pretty new. I think when Herman Cain, 15 years ago, talked about electrified border walls, that was a kind of shocking position, and I think that wouldn't find such gasps among Republicans anymore. So we'll see. I mean, there's always this idea that Latinos don't. I'm not going to say they don't care about immigration, but for them, it's not the top priority. But I think that this year, given the extreme Republican positions, will really test that theory.
And when you put Latinos in a focus group and you sit down and talk to them individually and say, what do you want to see from a politician? What do you want? What would make you vote for them, Democrat or Republican? They say some of the most basic things that we miss as political consultants in campaigns because we try to get too cute plus two. They always want to know, what are you going to do to help me? What are you going to give me? What are you going to give my family? And what people mean by give is like, how are you going to help them pay for their electric bill? How are you going to get them more money in their paycheck? How are you going to help them afford the cost of health care? How are you going to get them to help afford to maybe even one day send their kids to college and college affordability? So that's all wrapped in what Jerry's talking about in this economic portfolio of what they care about. If you really dial that down, it's what are you going to do to help me? If it was illegal and you could just walk around and hand out $100 bills, people would go vote all the time, because that $100, they already think about what they would spend that on. More food, diapers, electric bills, real life stuff of middle income families. And I think that's what almost in totality. And sure, do you have some right-wing Republicans who are like, it's all about Jesus and my gun, or some left-wing Latinos that are all about, it's all about trans rights or abortion or whatever those social issues of the day is on either side? That's prevalent in both parties and in our demographic. But at the core of who we are as voters, it's rooted in an economic populist message that really cuts to the heart of their aspirations. Because we're younger and a newer immigrant community, our community seems to be more aspirational than folks who've become more callous because they've given up on the American dream. When a lot of these folks have just showed up here and their parents have walked across thousands of miles of deserts just to have an opportunity to maybe acquire some wealth and to live that true American dream.
Amen. I couldn't have said that any better, man. That was fantastic. And, I want to just to put a finer point on that too, that, when Chuck said earlier, he would give credit to both Barack Obama and Donald Trump. I think that one thing that Donald Trump did was, from the first day in office, just constantly beat this drum that he's going to help Latinos with the economy. He, by the end of his, whether he was talking to all Latinos or just like the kind of business owners, he was talking about how he was slashing financial regulations to make it easier to start businesses. Unemployment, even if it started to go down during the Obama years, continued to go down during the Trump years. More Latinos bought homes during Trump's presidency than I want to say ever before. Chuck can correct me if I'm wrong, but by talking about high rates of home ownership, low unemployment, Latinos starting businesses at a record pace, I think Trump really was kind of beating the drum of the economy the whole time that he was in office. And I think Americans, the public, what we were paying attention to was one side of the screen that was all about the walls and rapists, murderers, and thugs or whatever. And then on the other side, we were kind of ignoring how he was showing up in evangelical churches, or having his kind of surrogates show up in evangelical churches, and talking to business groups like the Latino Coalition. So I think that that's important to pay attention to, and it seems like Biden's going to be maybe learning lessons.
Well, yeah, that brings me to my next question, is how are these priorities influencing the platforms of candidates in 2024? Can you elaborate on that, Chuck?
Well, I think the policy positions will always inform candidates. With Latino voters, I think that there's going to be I think we've hit on it a little bit here. It's going to change the narrative when it's what's the priority of the campaign ads that are run. And what worries me about my own party is there's lots of issues out there that are very resonant, like the Dobbs decision, and taking that reproductive freedom away from women and putting it back into the hands of the government and states and other things. And there's people on the right who disagree with that. There's a million polls out there that shows Latinos overwhelmingly support a woman's right to choose. But if that becomes a dominant issue, and that's the only thing, and I don't think that Democrats will do this, but it is a caution tale. If Democrats are using this issue because it does work, and there's been a special election, there's been a ballot initiative in Kansas, it works, and it works to get Democrats out. But to what me and Jerry just said, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the reason for most Latinos to vote are based around a populist economic message. And if we're just running ads around whatever social issue of the day is, that works for the right or the left, because the right will be running ads saying that we're trying to take control away from local schools, or take away the rights for children to do whatever with gender, or whatever the social issue of the day is. Both parties will use that to try to gin up their turnout, while that undecided Latino voter that's normally a non-college educated man and woman in their 30s who are sitting at home trying to figure out how to make ends meet, who care about choice. who also care about local school control, but their decisions on their everyday life are rooted in taking care of their family. I think that's what's missed when communicating with Latinos, because we assume if they live in a certain state or zip code that they're going to, again, act like their Black brethren or their white brethren. And we're running an English ad that the poster tells us will motivate this persuadable white suburban voter. And then we assume that that same English messaging will do the same to the Latino voter who's 15 years younger. That's just not the case. So it's a big thing that we miss in campaigns around messaging.
Totally. And maybe there isn't an answer to this yet, but what strategies are being employed to engage these younger Latinx voters? I mean, you mentioned some that don't work, but are there any that are working? Are there any that you
Sure, and we're a lot more
like...
we're a lot more online now. We are a lot more. I mean, TikTok is the dominant force in the way that Latinos are communicating. We talk about WhatsApp, and WhatsApp is a tool, especially for lots of Spanish speakers who come from countries where WhatsApp is very prevalent. But the way young Latinos are communicated, they're like young white kids are. They are on TikTok. They are on IG. So you see campaigns now running more YouTube advertising because studies have found by Equi's Lab, which is a nonprofit Latino research program, that most Latinos consume most of their information from YouTube and live on these social media platforms throughout the day, plus streaming music, which is really big. You can ask any Latino in America anywhere if they're 2 or they're 99 who Bad Bunny is, and they can tell you exactly and start singing lyrics because we just know. Exactly, right? So this is where if you want to talk to a Latino, show up where they're at, and it's going to be somewhere around that bad rabbit.
Gerardo, do you have anything else to add to that?
I never have anything to add to what Chuck says because,
He just packages it with a great bow and a great Texas accent.
Totally.
Love
Always.
For both of you, what barriers still need to be addressed to ensure greater participation here?
That's great. I mean, that's a wonderful question. I mean, I think instead of, again, I mean, this is stuff we've talked about a little bit. I mean, instead of taking for granted that at the end of the day, Latinos are going to show up to vote for you, you have to give them a reason to go and vote for you, for all the reasons we've already talked about, whether it's, speaking to the concerns of young people about the climate and educational debt, or whether it's about, families wanting to know what a candidate is going to do for them. I mean, you need to be motivated and you need to believe in a political system that change in the direction that you want it to happen is a real possibility. So I think that, as we talked about, the early Spanish language ad spending is encouraging. That's good. That shows someone was listening. It shows a marked contrast with how things have happened in the past, but I think there's a long way to go yet. I mean, it's almost strange to be talking about this a year out because we have no idea what the Republican side of things is going to look like. I mean, we know that Donald Trump seems to be running miles ahead of his competitors, and I don't have any reason to think that that will change. But, once the trials get started, once visuals happen of him in courtrooms, maybe even behind bars, I have no idea what that's going to look like, So I would just say, the early movements that the Democratic Party has made are encouraging, and I only hope that they will keep their foot on the gas for the next year.
Chuck, anything to add to that?
I just think that it's really important for people to understand when they see polls and they talk about Latino voters, it's really important for this conversation to understand a couple things that we should have started with. And I sat here as the professor was talking and thought about that, is that, and I'm going to look to Jerry to make sure I'm right, 60% of all the Latinos in America live in 4 states, California, New York, Florida, and Texas. Over half of all the Latinos in America live in just 4 states. Last time I looked, it was almost 65%. And if you throw in Illinois, you are at 70% of all of them. Let's just, for this conversation, put Illinois in there. California, Texas, Florida, New York, Illinois, all the big cities, right? So the huge percentage of Latinos live there. Well, guess what? There's no presidential campaign that's going to spend any money in any of those states, and this is very important, y'all, has never really spent any money in those states. There was some spent in Florida, like in 2016, going back to the Obama days, but that's really important that there's been no money spent in any of these states, and all of our voters live there. So when you look at national polls saying what direction Latino voters are caring about, you're talking about states where there really haven't been any information unless you live in a targeted House race or congressional race. There's been no real spending there. But the Latino vote does live in places that will matter, and the presidential election will only spend money in about 5 states. The Senate states, in the Senate races, about 5 states, and in the House races, like 6 states. So all those elections will happen in a vacuum, in a very small group of Latinos that just happen to be very high proportion or in those areas will really make the difference. And those are the Latino voters that will matter the most.
And my final question to you both, as Latinx voters and the Latinx demographic increases in this country, how do you see the democratic shift impact the broader political landscape and the future of democracy in the United States?
Roger.
Such a good question. Again, so I feel like we need your counterpart here, Chuck, your brother Mike Madrid, because he's always talking about what the so-called Latinization of the United States means for the future of the country. So be a great voice to add here. But I don't know how you're feeling about this moment in the history of our country, Chuck, but for me, it's almost like I know that we're 3 years away from celebrating our semi-quincentennial, our 250th anniversary, and that ought to be a big celebration of everything it means to be America. A celebration also, a kind of hard look at reevaluating where we've been and with all of the, challenges we've faced and overcome. And so, I think that this could be a moment for national unity, but I have a really hard time imagining what's going to happen after 2024. I mean, it still seems very fragile, contested. I'm not saying we're going to sink into the ocean or anything, but it's hard to say what the future of the United States is going to look like. But that said, I am 100% confident more and more every day that Latinos are going to have an important role to play in that future. I think we've done a lot of thinking and debating over the past few years about the beginning of the United States, the origins of the United States. We've gone through African-American history in 1619 and the legacies of enslavement, things like that. But I think that for Latinos, we still have that kind of moment where we're still trying to explain to the country, our long, centuries-long presence here, our centuries of contributions to this country. And we've still it's been a challenge to make all Americans realize that the future present of the country is Latino. So I think that Latinos are going to play a really important role in politics for as long as our country exists, and I think that you can see that in some concrete ways, like the election of more and more Latinos across the country. That's just one way that has to do with politics. But I mean, I live in Chicago, and I'm thinking a lot about Chicago public schools these days. And, 50% of all of Chicago's public school students are Latinos right now. And that number has gone up over the past decade. So, as those kids, become voting Americans or working Americans, college educated Americans, adults, whatever, they're going to shape the country.
I like to break this down into 2 categories. One is culture and the other is politics. There's no doubt that our culture, our beautiful brown diaspora from all over the world of all different shades of black and brown and white for that matter, is really culturally impacting the country quicker than it is with politics. Sister Maddie, what the -- streamed artist in the world is, and we were just talking about it, it's Bad Bunny, and he sings only in Spanish. The #1. That means he's beat the biggest black entertainer, who is Beyonce, and the biggest white entertainer, who is Taylor Swift, who are having concerts all over America this year. Love both of them if they're listening. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Like, I love them all. But Bad Bunny has dominated. Absolutely. If they all 3 have a concert, it'd blow up the internet. But anyway.
I'd be there, yeah.
Exactly.
Or the regionales too.
Exactly.
Summer,
Yep. And so the culture, our beautiful culture now has become part of America's culture because we are turning 18 and coming of age so quickly. And these second generation and third generation Latino Americans, Hispanic Americans, it's just changing the way we look at music, culture, food. There are now these modern Mexican restaurants and all of the stuff that's beautiful that's happening. You have people now where our culture is intermingling because of mixed race couples that just happened at a bigger race that was literally illegal 100 years ago. You couldn't do that. Like my mom and dad couldn't be legally married. My mother's white, my father's Mexican, who they were married in 1967. Like that's a big deal. That was before the Loving decision. So like this is all these huge changes that are happening. And then politically, just based off of the raw numbers of our growth in Arizona, which will be a battleground state, Nevada, which will be a battleground state, Georgia, which is a battleground state, all these Puerto Ricans that moved to Pennsylvania, it's a battleground state. The Mexican immigrants who have all been in Milwaukee and other places to chase those jobs will always be there. We're going to be a bigger and bigger part of the politics. I'm not guaranteeing that we'll always be super duper Democratic or that they're all going to run the Republican Party. The beautiful thing about all these Latinos that are coming of age is they're up for grabs. Listen to me, both parties. They don't know if they're Democrats or Republicans. Most of their mothers and fathers were, in fact, Democrats. And luckily for us Democrats, most of these young people align with a value set that aligns with Bernie Sanders and the left of the Democratic Party. But you have to go work them and talk to them because they're not automatically going to be as easy to get as their mother and fathers were. They want us to work harder for that vote. And I think that's the lesson today. This vote is up for grabs. Our power can be shifted to put lots of people into political office, and we should get the repercussions of that back by respect for our community, the economic development that our community needs, and make sure that the social infrastructure is there so that that young immigrant mother who faces everything to get to this country, that their sons or daughters can be the president of the United States, run a corporation, or be, for God's sakes, a political consultant like me who never went to college, who grew up in a trailer house. This is truly the last bastion of what the American dream really is. And as long as we don't lose that vision, and if I can make it, anybody can make it. And I think that's the lesson.
Yeah, I just to underscore one thing you said, Chuck, is that I all of the cultural and political changes that are taking place, it is important to not believe that that's going to point in one single direction. You know, I mean, it's going to go in lots of different directions, but regardless of which direction it goes in, I can guarantee you, because of the cultural and political changes, that Latinos are going to be at the front of the change.
I want to ask one final quick question. We've referred to this group different ways, Latinx, Latino. Where do you all stand on that? And do you think that, and I know we don't have a lot of time, so let's keep it brief. Do you think that plays a factor? You know, if someone who doesn't identify the way they're being spoken to about, does that impact, you know, what they think of that candidate or person?
I tell my candidates to be culturally competent on where they're at. In New Mexico, they call each other Hispanic. In certain parts of Texas, it's Tejano. In certain parts of LA, it's Chicano or it's Latino. Like we deserve the right to call ourselves what we want. That's proportionate to where you're from. If I'm in an LGBTQ setting and I'm talking to that, I will use Latinx myself, even though I don't use that on mail pieces or in TV commercials. I want to be respectful to the people that I think deserve to be called and identify any way that they want to that goes back tied to our culture.
Yeah. I understand that this is a super confusing concept for non-Latinos and I mean, I think it's controversial among Latinos. It's much debated among Latinos, but I think for non-Latinos, it just creates a lot of confusion because they don't know what to call us, what to make of this. I mean, I've spoken with representatives of law firms who have told me that they just opened a new office in Miami where people call themselves Hispanics, but a lot of the younger attorneys they're trying to hire don't want to be called Hispanics. They want to be called Latinx. So I think this question about naming does have kind of real world consequences because you have employers literally just not knowing. They want to be sensitive to the desires of their employees, but they just don't know exactly what they should call them. So they call in people like me, people like Chuck, to try to frame this issue for them. And I think, I don't know that I can ever answer that question, but what I think for me, the basic principles is always kind of mutual respect and the rights of any individual to be called what they want to be called, at the same time that you understand that not everyone is going to want to be called that way. Now, that super fuzzy answer is not helpful, though, for candidates who do have to call them something. It's not helpful for the US government writing census forms who do have to call them something. Right now, those two, it's Hispanic or Latino. That's what's on government forms. If Latinos want to change that, I think they can kind of lobby for change and have other terms included on government forms. But I think it's a constant battle between wanting to be as open-ended and mutually understanding and flexible about this, with the necessity of trying to fit things into a particular box.
Totally. I guess that means we'd all have to agree on something. And I don't know.
I mean, but I've sometimes thought about maybe it should just be Latin and then an underscore where you can kind of fill in whatever after.
Blank. Yes.
But then the only word you see is Latin, and then we don't want to be called Latin either. So I don't know. Chuck, or you could embrace Chuck's term, call yourself a Mexican redneck, and that's it, right?
This is true. Make a lot of money off of that.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for your time and expertise on this. I really appreciate it. And thank you all who were listening. I hope this was informing.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I am Jatan Bosby-Gilchrist, bringing you greetings from the birthplace of the civil rights movement, Montgomery, Alabama. I serve as the executive director of the ACLU of Alabama, that is part of the 54 affiliate network of the National ACLU. I'm pleased to join you today along with my esteemed panelists for this rich and timely conversation, the battle for reproductive health care access. We know it's been 1 year and 3 months since the Dobbs decision and essentially the fall of Roe. Now, in a post-Roe society, it's imperative that we continue talking about the importance of reproductive health care and abortion access that is essentially not fully accessible to much of this nation. We have two individuals who I think will be able to speak to this and really build off of a rich conversation that we will have here today. Senior Vice President of Policy, Jacqueline Ayers. She leads Planned Parenthood Federation of America, PPFA. She leads the strategic direction of the Federation's legislative affairs, global advocacy, federal and state policy teams. Jacqueline, you are also an alum of the ACLU, so good to connect with you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having Planned Parenthood.
Fantastic. Next, we have Busy Phillips, who is a New York Times bestselling author, actor, activist, and podcast host of Busy Phillips is Doing Her Best. And with all of the things that she's achieved and been in our living rooms and on our screens for so much, she was also the only woman with a late night talk show from 2018 to 2019, Busy Tonight. Her upcoming projects includes Girls 5 Eva and an upcoming film, Mean Girls the Musical, that will be released in January. Thank you so much for joining us, Busy.
Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. So I really want to frame up this conversation. As I shared, we are a year post the Dobbs decision that really impacted much of this nation. For example, the state of Alabama has an all-out outlaw of abortion, so much so that abortion is criminalized in the state. Physicians can lose their licenses and also face up to 99 years in prison. So this is really a critical moment and an inflection point. And it's organizations, yes, like the ACLU, but so many of the independent clinics that do this work and grassroots organizations and abortion funds that really help drive the fact that abortion access, but more broadly, reproductive health care is so central. Jacqueline, I know you know about this because Planned Parenthood has been foundational in this work for decades. So can you really give us and build off of this context of what does it mean to live in a post? But honestly, the fact of the matter is this has been going on
for decades. The opposition has been mounting for years. Can you tell us how that has showed up in state legislatures across the country?
Thank you again so much, and for giving us this opportunity to really ground us in what has been happening. I think joining us from a place like Alabama, you understand all too well that in fact Roe was never truly enough, and that too many people, because of income, because of access to healthcare, because of racism and discriminatory practices in the healthcare system, we have long seen that people have not been able to realize their constitutional right. And so yeah, I can't believe that it's been over 15 months since we saw the Dobbs decision, 17 months since the Supreme Court decision was actually leaked, and we knew the direction they were headed. But if we're honest with ourselves, I think we knew what was going to happen, because those who are opposed to sexual and reproductive health care have really locked in structural disadvantages in the system, creating massive barriers to health care, dismantling civil rights, making it more difficult to access a right to vote for those elected officials who will stand with us on access to healthcare. And so what I think we've seen is well over 400 pieces of legislation that have been advanced in the last decade. And so there have been a long trudging of rolling back rights over and over again. And we're seeing that the opposition are not just going after abortion rights. They've had a very long systemic approach to going after all of our rights. And so the same states that have gone after abortion rights, have gone after voting rights, have gone after LGBTQ rights. We're considering to see currently those are the same states who are banning books and going after trans kids' access. And so what the Dobbs decision, I think, has brought clear and woken up so many people is that we can't rely on the courts anymore to be the arbiters of our justice. We know that right now we're seeing too many rights dismantled, and we see more and more people, after watching a 50-year the Roe v. Wade decision fall, more and more people are seeing that the attacks are coming from every angle, and Americans simply do not support it. So I think, the work ahead is really going to be to focus people on the fact that we actually can fight back and get our rights back.
Jacqueline, thank you so much. You said something that I want to elevate. The federal courts, particularly the court systems, are not the arbiters of justice. And I think that says a lot. You're realizing, and all that you said is this work, when we talk about reproductive healthcare access, when we talk about abortion access, it is intersectional. We talk about this work in a very intersectional manner. So when we make these decisions, we have to understand the impact of these policies. Something that you also said that I just want to reframe is essentially the power of this work is in the people, it's in the communities. So I would like to know what folks can do and what we can think through in our own communities, in our own states, to partner with, yes, national organizations like Planned Parenthood, like the ACLU nationally, but also grassroots organizations.
Yeah, I think what this moment calls for is just to be really bold, unapologetic. If we think about past movements and history, we've seen that, particularly thinking about, movements like the Civil Rights Movement, we saw that people really are acting, being bold, unapologetic, making sure they're leveraging a lot of different approaches. And something that we actively think and talk about at Planned Parenthood is how we need to center health equity. And that is best done when we center the voices of patients and the people who are most in need. That includes reflecting the experiences of the communities that are most directly impacted. And so, yes, working with national and grassroots groups is important. But I really appreciate what you noted about supporting community-led organizations, groups that are on the ground, groups that are already doing this work. In Planned Parenthood, we actively work across our 49 affiliates in 50 states. We have designated teams who are thinking about this all the time. Our Black organizing program, our RAIS program works specifically in Black and Latino communities, making sure they get information and resources to get healthcare, but also how to get activated, how to get involved. On the advocacy side, we want to make sure those are the voices that are lifted up to lawmakers so they understand what's at stake for their constituents constituents, and that they are really the voices that are helping to push and involve health equity in all the decision making that they are doing. So I think we know what's ahead of us because the attacks are going to continue, because they're completely misaligned with what we know polling tells us. Over 80% of Americans do not support attacks on reproductive health care. Polling tells us that since the Dobbs decision, in fact, more conservatives actually do not want to see rights completely dismantled. So we're going to have to work with the current administration that we have, pressure Congress, work in the states, continue to fight back in the courts, and make sure, obviously, that we're doing everything we can in the upcoming year to make sure that it's abortion rights champions that are the ones who are going to get a chance to speak out for the communities that are best served. But we know that's only going to happen if we lead with the people who are local, community-based, and begin with organizing.
But Jacqueline, can I just add here that I think the fact that in the 7 states that have put abortion on the ballot since Dobbs fell, they've had such incredible turnout to support abortion rights, and the anti-abortion sides in all 7 instances have failed. I think it was a miscalculation, and that's why you see them pivoting to trans children, to LGBTQ, to book bans. They're like deflecting, trying to deflect, and the focus that everybody needs to continue to have is that this is all the same fight, and we need to show up for bodily autonomy and for voting rights and for the rights of all Americans, especially when the vast majority of Americans support access to abortion.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think what Busy is telling us is that if you bring this question to the people, the ballots, no matter if it's so-called red states or blue states or purple states, you bring this question to the people are clear where they are.
Absolutely. And Busy, thank you for jumping in here. I think elevate a critical point. Those who have actually placed abortion on ballot initiatives, folks have shown up in droves to say something else and to state something else. And I think that is powerful. We have seen that in Kentucky and Kansas and Ohio and
Michigan.
Yes. And the thing about it is that is, I think a real inflection point in this country. It starts with the people, but then it is elevated. Sometimes electoral politics doesn't get us there, but policy does. But policies are driven by individuals and by communities, and we are seeing that. So Busy, I really want to bring you into this conversation, primarily because you are also representing something that I think is important, a platform. As an artist, as an activist, and with a story. And so in this advocacy work, we are always centering the power of storytelling because people have to know how things impact folks directly. That is how you change hearts and minds. And I would love to bring you into this conversation primarily because I just recently watched the Glamour Women of the Year Award in 2022, where you talked about your abortion story. However, you've been talking about your abortion story as far back as 2018 when you wrote your book, and so many times since then. And I think that just really emphasizes the power of storytelling and truly the obligation and responsibility that we have to do that when we have a platform. So I really want to bring you in to talk about, first of all, your passion, not just how you got here, but how you are leveraging your platform to make a real impact in these times.
Yeah, well, thank you. Listen, I think that for a long time, what felt so scary about talking about abortion and your own experience with abortion was the fact that the anti-abortion folks have been very loud and actually very scary, historically speaking. And so, I think for a public figure to come forward and talk about an abortion, I think a woman in with her friends sometimes didn't want to talk about her abortion. And became clear to me around 2018 after I had watched, always been a long time Planned Parenthood supporter. They were there for me when I was 15. I'm there for them the rest of my life, whatever they need. But was watching these trap laws being passed. And then as these extreme abortion bans started to creep in, and I couldn't believe that they were getting passed. There was no question that I was going to write about my abortion in my book. But when in Georgia, when they signed the extreme abortion ban in Georgia, that was when I used the opportunity to, I had a late night talk show. This is why we need more representation on screen. So I was able to really speak to my own personal experience, and what I wanted to really impart to viewers and anyone who was paying attention to that show was, and of course it got spun up nationally and got picked up all around the world. But if you're sitting there and you're thinking, you don't know anyone who's had an abortion, you do. You know and love, We Testify, Shout Your Abortion, all of these incredible organizations paved the way for, me to be able to sit on my talk show and say, you know me and you like me, right? And you don't think I'm a bad person. And, for me, part of what I feel like my mission in life is to destigmatize having a uterus and all that goes with it. Because I lived my life feeling so much shame for it for a long time when I was a young woman coming of age. And I don't want I never wanted my daughters to have that. So, talking about periods, talking about endometriosis, talking about abortions, talking about D&Es and D&Cs, talking about reproductive justice, talking about the disparity of healthcare between what Black women experience when they're pregnant and seeking healthcare and what white women in this country experience, regardless of socioeconomic status. Like all of these things are so important. And the more that, people who get put on peoplemagazine.com can talk about it, the more your neighbor and you and your friend at church and your daughter and all of the other people with uteruses in your life are going to feel that it's normalized and okay for us to have these conversations. So that's been part of my mission, I guess. Well, continuing on.
Thank you so much for that, Bissy. There's something that you elevated that I have to bring to the forefront, and Jacqueline, you touched on this. Roe was just 50 years old before it fell. And we have to keep in mind, there are women in this country that remember a time before Roe. Mm-hmm. And they fought consistently to ensure that Roe was a right for that next generation. And I often tell this story about being so viscerally, just not just in shock, because we knew this was happening. They have been going after abortion rights for over a decade in the state of Alabama, through trap laws, through egregious policies that not just focus on reproductive healthcare clinics or abortion clinics, but also physicians. And so being in that space, I remember that June, I asked an elder, well, now we're starting at zero. So what are we to do now? And she looks at me and she says, you build it back better, because that's what we did. And I would like both of you actually to share your perspectives on, first of all, knowing the work and how it has preceded this time, but moreover, how those stories have either impacted you or ignited you in building back a stronger world or democracy that centers the stories of pregnant individuals and women and the core importance of bodily and medical autonomy.
Yeah, I'll get started.
You can go first.
I was just gonna say first, I wanted to say thank you so much to Busy for being outspoken, using her platform. I think something you referenced is the fact that sometimes we can't wait on politicians. We actually need to change the culture, right? And being able to change the culture and being able to change the conversations with the voices that you know, the podcasts you listen to, the books you read, and what you watch on TV has a lot to do about how that informs your worldview and the rights that you want to see. And so it's so important not to skip over the fact that, you know, what Busy does and so many who have a platform are actually going to help us think about that next world. They're going to help us form the vision because they're going to want and see much more than what they have. I think, you know, since Dobbs, people have been outraged because politicians have been so extreme. We're seeing doctors who are feeling like they can't take care of their patients, people having to travel hundreds of miles across state lines just to get healthcare. And people are reading the headlines and they're hearing their stories from their friends, and they're now more comfortable talking about their experiences during this post-Roe world. And I think that means we're going to see increasingly that people understand that it's not just about the issues of abortion. It's troubling what's happening to our democracy, because let's understand, if they were to take away a 50-year right like Roe, they're going to continue to try and take away additional rights and keep coming. I mean, since Dobbs, we've seen many types of new attacks. The very idea that you would try to restrict somebody's ability to leave the state of Idaho, for example, and try to legislate your ability to leave in and out of the state, it's like literal modern day slavery, right? And so we know that they're going to continue to come after rights. It's only going to fuel people to understand what's happening is very troubling, not just for abortion rights, but for our democracy. People understand that they need to have their views reflected, and what is being put forward is frankly undemocratic. And so, you know, I think that when we reimagine the right to access, we are going to have now a conversation that is much more inclusive, broader than 1973 Roe, which we have to remember the right was established by courts, not by doctors. We want to center patients and people. We want to make sure that people have the dignity and autonomy to take care of their bodies, that they can afford the healthcare they need, that they have the ability to parent or not to parent, as leaders in the reproductive justice movement have long fought for. And so, you know, I think that as we work to rebuild this right, if it's state by state, if it's through a federal bill, if it's through a different Congress, through keeping a president who supports reproductive health care and rights, we know that ultimately what we're going to see people stand for is restoring democracy, making the institutions actually work again for people. And that's how we save abortion rights.
Yeah, I mean, yes. And to build a little bit on that, I think building back more, I want to see midwives and doulas. I want to see, there are still so many states where it is illegal to practice midwifery, which of course we know goes back to enslaved people and laws against enslaved people taking their own care of their own health care, and witches, right? Because they thought we were all witches. But we need more women in legislature to be able to help pass these laws, because they're the ones that understand. I mean, when you hear some of these things, my God, it would be funny if it weren't so heartbreaking. Some of the ideas that these men in charge have about women's bodies and how they work, even some women, quite frankly. But yes, I'd like to see expanded care expanded to midwives and doulas, making sure that every state, it's legal for them to practice. And I want to see our maternal mortality rate especially among Black and brown women in this country. I want to see it go down. I want to see it plummet. There's no reason why, except for the fact that care has become so abysmal in our country, and access to care has become so difficult for people to get, not just even abortion care, but also just checkups and consistent care with the same doctor. It makes a difference. I was, of course, lucky enough to have the same OBGYN. Sorry, hello? I don't know what happened. Someone else popped up. I was lucky enough to have the same OBGYN for my entire pregnancy. My older daughter, her fluid was very low in my 9th month. I know many other doctors who probably, if they hadn't seen me all the way through, would have induced me immediately. And then who knows what could have happened. My doctor it was August. He said, go to the corner and buy a giant thing of water and drink it and walk around a little and come back. Let's look. I was fine. My baby was born naturally, no drugs, no complications. 2 days later, I had that privilege of having a doctor who knew my body. That's what we need to get back into healthcare for women. That we're not baby making factories. We're not machines. We're humans. And so as we think about reproductive justice in the future, yes, all of the things that all of Sister Song and the leaders of the reproductive justice movement have been asking for, and also how do we fix the insurance situation that is causing these practices to have 40 doctors and you never see the same one twice? How do we make sure that the maternal mortality rate goes down and it's consistent care and it's access to good care and it's making it affordable and free? And that's what I'd like to see.
You are, they say, pass the plate. So that was a sermon. So thank you so much for elevating that. You both really honed in on two things. That just a week ago, the ACLU of Alabama won a preliminary injunction to allow freestanding birthing centers to operate in the state of Alabama. And we represented midwives in the state of Alabama. Our Alabama Department of Public Health, was trying to make freestanding birthing centers get a license to be a hospital. We know that midwives and birth workers provide necessary care, particularly in areas that do not have labor and obstetrics care for communities. And Busy, you made a very great point. We know the history of midwives in this country, particularly for Black communities. And there is such value in the work that they do that is truly holistic care. Alabama has the 3rd highest maternal mortality rate in the nation, one of the highest infant mortality rates in the nation. This is a broader conversation about what healthcare looks like for individuals, and particularly what healthcare looks like for Black communities, for people who live in rural communities, especially when you have an onslaught of closings of hospitals in these communities. And so the importance of midwives, doulas, birth workers is imperative. It is imperative to true holistic care and getting us to what comprehensive reproductive health care looks like. Jacqueline, you elevated the conversation as it relates to essentially what we've defined as the conspiracy statute. So trying to criminalize individuals who are helping people seek abortions out of state because we live in a state that does not allow for abortions. And so what we as an organization have done is we sued our attorney general, who said that he was going to come after individuals and people who are supporting individuals to seek abortions out of state, that he would prosecute them. So we filed a lawsuit against him and the 42 DAs in the state because we have to set a precedent. You cannot go after people. That is unconstitutional. That is a violation of their First Amendment rights. And this is going to be what we will continue seeing. Now that abortion is outlawed, we are constantly seeing in state legislatures, people still coming after individuals. It just doesn't seem to be enough. And that is a broader conversation. There was also something elevated here called saying a reimagining. So I want to shift us to that, this reimagining of what our world looks like, what access looks like, a reimagining of democracy. I think that there's so much here in this conversation that you both have elevated. And I would like to know, in not just in your experience, but what does this reimagining mean to you and fighting for? But I think the truth of the matter is we can't be what we can't see, and we have to have a vision of our way forward. So what does this reimagining look like for you of holistic reproductive health care, of a democracy that actually centers bodily autonomy, the stories and the experiences of women and pregnant people, and individuals in this space?
Well, I'll just say that for me, part of the reimagining has to start with who's representing and who we as a nation decide to elect locally, at the state level, and nationally to represent us. And it needs to be more reflective of what our country actually is. The fact that there are more senators named John than there are mothers in the Senate, this is a fact that I got from my Vote Mama fundraiser I co-hosted the other night, is mind-boggling. We know that parents in legislature, but specifically mothers, are going to fight for healthcare, for women, abortion rights, education, paid leave, expanded healthcare access, all of these things, protecting kids, stricter gun laws, because this is it's all tied together. So, in Virginia has a very important election that's about to happen. And Virginia is the last Southern state that does not have an abortion ban. And they are seeing, Jacqueline, and I'm sure you both can probably speak to how the influx that Virginia has seen. And I was with LaSharice Glade the other night, who's running in Virginia and must win. And the day after I was with her, I read an article that billionaires have dumped an additional $4.4 million to make sure that the MAGA extremists can get Virginia. It's an attack, and I can't fight billionaires. I can't. I don't know about you, but I can use my voice, and I can motivate others to use theirs, and I can help people understand actionable steps they can take so that representation is reflective of their own experience and the policies that we need to see. I'm not saying everything can be fixed in government. We know this, that it can't be, but until we start to see a reflection of what America is in our legislation, I think that it is going to be a much tougher battle.
Yeah, no, I totally agree that the lawmakers have to reflect the views of their constituents. And, to bring it back to that point about culture, when I think about this past year, the amount of defiance that we have seen in people taking to the streets, who are resisting, who are speaking out, who are telling their story, but also a lot of hope, right, for visioning something new. I'm sure we all have friends, families, ourselves who saw people celebrating celebrating women, celebrating femininity, whether you went to Beyonce or Taylor Swift or whatever you did this the Barbie movie, and you like came out in girl groups to enjoy yourself. Like that defiant hope of how people are going to turn their resistance into action, and the fact that they are going to continue to get out is changing culture. And I think that's actually the pathway in which we're going to see more and more states that are going to have to stand on the sides of where people are, and to get a little bit legal, right? I think ultimately the vision is we're going to need to see the right reestablished, reimagined through new legal theories that probably don't exist right now. We look to the states like New York, who are going to put on the ballot this question of an equal rights amendment, so that it's about gender equality, that inclusive LGBTQ rights, it's inclusive of abortion rights, that we want to see these states that can be test theories for how, when we get our rights back into the Constitution, they're much more expansive and not limited in the way that Roe in fact was. And I think that what is giving me hope and vision is that all of that defiant energy can be turned into action, where we see ultimately 38 states that will say we're going to pass a referendum, that the people want to see their constitution amended. And just because it hasn't been done in 100+ years doesn't mean that it can't be done now. So I continue to think we can reimagine the right and reestablish the legal theories that make it impossible just for 5 justices to take that right away.
But I also think we all have to keep talking, sharing, and yeah, there can be joy in the work. I totally agree. But also I was what inspired me this week was the woman from Tennessee, Allie Phillips. We have the same last name, Allie Phillips, who was one of the women who sued the state of Tennessee, right? Because she was denied access to care that she desperately needed. And now she's running. She's running for office. And I'm so inspired by that. I want to see more women and who have had it and want to go in and make a difference. By the way, it's not going to be me, but
We never know, Busy. Don't say no too soon. Don't say no too soon. The influence, is there. And I'm telling you, you're in the pulpit. So there's power. There's power in representation. So thank you for that. All right. So there's something that I want to share regarding reimagining. And as I said, I really feel this work is community centered and community led. And that is what really enacts change that is beyond systemic change, that is transformative. And it is the independent clinics in the state of Alabama that are still functioning despite or in spite of the fact that they are not providing abortions. They are still providing care to these within the parameters that they can. And although that may be limiting, it is their sense of obligation to still show up. And so I think that says something to me that inspires me, but also allows me to reimagine what care looks like. I think about abortion funds. So in Alabama, we have the Yellowhammer Fund that is led by Janice Fountain, who is a powerhouse organizer, is literally taking a bus in communities across the state and passing out contraceptives and Plan Bs and diapers and all of these things that are necessary for actual reproductive health care, meeting people where they're at, their needs. And lastly, I want to elevate someone like Michelle Browder. If you all are familiar with the Mothers of Gynecology and the conversation about what reproductive justice really is, and the stories of Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, enslaved women were operated on by J. Marion Sims, who is known as the godfather of gynecology. Michelle Browder is an artivist, an artist who is also an activist, and has erected these beautiful, beautiful sculptures of these women, and really centers this conversation in a real way. And so those are just some individuals and some things that I'm seeing in my own community, in my own state, that allow me to continue to move forward in this work. Last question for you both. You've shared what reimagining looks like for you, what is giving you hope, and we need to leave folks with something to do. So I would like to hear from both of you, something to do. What is next in this work? Jacqueline?
Yeah, I'll start. I'll just say, obviously, in November, there are important elections. So even if you don't sit in Virginia or Ohio, where will have a ballot question that they are facing, donate. Make phone calls. You don't need to be in a state where there's an election to take action. So there is always an opportunity. And for Planned Parenthood affiliates and our political and advocacy organizations, we're going to be continuing to make sure that we're getting abortion rights champions elected and into office. And I would also say is something that you just noted is the importance of knowing what's going on in your local community. The community-led organizations like abortion funds and independent providers are so important. They need your support, your volunteer time, your donations. And we want to make sure that they continue to do the work, whether it's helping people get out of state or helping people get access to the care they need in state. That's extremely important. And then I would just end with continuing to understand the lived experiences of people, particularly doctors, providers, as you mentioned, every day. They're going to continue to provide care. We want to be able to support them. And so show up at your local rally, make sure your voices is heard, tell your own story if you have not, encourage patients to speak out and advocate. And we can always, most importantly, is organize. So make sure you have a plan for 2023 and 2024, canvas, phone, bake, donate, do it all again, because we know, in fact, those who are seeking to roll back our rights are not the majority. We are. And we have the strength in movements if we come together and organize together to make sure that everybody is able to ultimately have true reproductive freedom.
One of my dear friends, and she was a writer on the talk show, Shantira Jackson, said, "We have the numbers for good. We have the numbers for good. We just have to all get together." And I remember just loving how succinct that was. We have the numbers for good. And anytime I feel despair when they move the bar, when the voters are purged, 3 weeks ahead of the election in Virginia, when the billionaires come in backing MAGA Republicans, I think to myself, we have the numbers for good. And it is going to take all of us to come together. And so actionable steps, obviously, all of the things that Jacqueline mentioned. And then on top of it, I do believe in continuing to talk about it with your family, with the men in your life, with the young boys in your life, the teenagers, with the teens in your life. Continue talking about what this means and the impact that it has. And I think what has been, my mother was of the generation that remembered before Roe. And I remember her being so devastated and saying, I'm going to cry, and saying, "Busy, I thought that we did it. I didn't know. I didn't know that we had to keep showing up for this. And now that you know, you have to do better." So now that we know, we all have a job to continue to show up, and not just every 4 years. On the local level is so important. And yeah, I would just encourage people to continue remembering that there is hope, there is a path, and that we have the numbers for good.
Be inspired, because we have the numbers for good. Thank you both for the work that you were doing. Thank you for showing up. And thank you all for joining us for such an important conversation. Be well and onward.